Seeing that it is 6:34 p.m. and we have full quorum, I'll call this meeting to order and offer the following motion that we enter into executive session in accordance with Open Meeting Law, Mass General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A, pursuant to Purpose 3, to discuss strategy with respect to collective bargaining, APEA Units A, B, and C, because the chair finds that an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the bargaining position of the committee, and we have plans to return to open session following this executive session. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. This requires a roll call vote. We'll begin on this end.
Kosensky, aye.
Marriott, aye.
Ordonez, aye.
Nakajima, aye.
Sullivan, aye.
Spitzer, aye.
McDonald, aye.
Demling abstain, and just a note to the chair, I won't be attending the executive session since my wife is an employee of the APEA union.
Thank you.
Menino, aye.
Okay. We are now in executive session. We'll return following the session. Okay. Seeing the presence of a quorum again, we will call this session of the Amherst Pelham Regional School Committee back to order in public session. The first order of business is approval of the minutes. And the minutes are for March 20th, 2018.
I'll move to approve the minutes of Tuesday, March 20th, 2018.
Is there a second? It's been moved and seconded. Are there any comments, changes, additions? That wasn't one, was it? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes of March 20th, 2018, signify by raising your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Any nays? Abstentions? 2 abstentions. 7-0-2. The minutes are approved. Thank you very much. Moving forward on the agenda, the next item is announcements and public comments. Just before we get to public comments, my first announcement would be to welcome 2 new members of our school committee, Allison McDonald and Carrie Spitzer. Welcome.
Thank you.
Very welcome. And it doesn't get much more formal than that, unfortunately. So it's terrific to have you here. We'll move to public comments, then move back to announcements. For public comments, if people are not aware, there are couple things of significance. One, if you have a public comment, you should come to the microphone, state your name, address the committee as a whole. You have up to 3 minutes to speak, which I'll time using my handy device, which I'll now open up. And typically, if people are not aware of this, the committee the committee never engages in a discussion with the public. So this is an opportunity for us to hear from you. So feel free to come forward. If there's a matter that comes up that is considered by the committee to have some topical relevance to the work of the committee, it would be scheduled for a future meeting or addressed as appropriate between meetings. Further, as people may be aware, typically in our committee meetings, due to the role of the school committee as the contracting entity and the policymaking entity, and also the overseer manager of the superintendent of the district, there are rules that tend to govern the nature of the discussion or the conversation that occurs. So typically, we refrain, but also we request the public refrain from comments that might characterize individual employees in the district. There are other vehicles or means of being able to bring forward that information, but it's something that for us could, particularly if in any circumstance where it gets into sort of evaluation of personnel, it can be challenging for us, and so including legally challenging for the committee. And so typically, even though we don't debate the items, it's not unusual for the chair to rule out of order comments if they did so. Hopefully this is helpful, by the way. So we don't answer questions, we don't debate the audience. We take the information back. We work as a committee to address it commonly, and the comments are brought forward to the committee as a whole. We got everything?
Yeah.
Okay. We won't do this every time we have new members, but it's helpful occasionally to do it. So public comment period is open. If anyone wants to comment, please come forward. Up to 3 minutes. You could state your name, and you're welcome.
Dr. Baptiste.
My name is Chrissy Harmon. I'm a licensed Massachusetts educator, a doctoral student at school psychology at UMass Amherst, and a mother of 3 in Amherst, Mass. I was recently asked to be on the parent representative on the hiring committee for the Amherst Regional Principal Search. As you know, the current principal at the middle school is an interim principal and has been for 2 years. She's not licensed, has been an art teacher, but that's not an active license, and she is not enrolled in a DESE accredited administration education training program. Despite her not meeting minimum qualifications for candidacy for principal, the current interim principal's application was in the pile for candidates for the recent hiring committee, presumably because she had already held the position for 2 years. The hiring committee was assembled to determine which of the candidates selected by the superintendent were to be finalists. Our job was to select 3 for hire, as they had been screened for qualifications such as licensure and background. This was our instruction. The hiring committee was led by our newly appointed director, equity director, and it was executed with great fidelity and comprised of qualified, experienced candidates from the Amherst Public Schools and the community. After the process was complete, we debriefed, rated the candidates, and tallied up our first and second and third picks. The current principal was not on the list for a myriad of reasons, the primary being that she is not licensed. DESE requires that licensed candidates must be considered first, and only then can unlicensed candidates be considered. Since we selected 3 excellent licensed candidates, the current principal was not on the list. A week passed, and on March 21st, the superintendent sent out an email stating that the selected finalists were delayed due to conductions of reference checks. 2 weeks later, the superintendent sent out an email saying that the background was deemed as why the entire pool of candidates could not be recommended for hire. I happen to have knowledge that no references were checked at all. Despite this, and indicating that the next step was to bring in the candidates to meet the community, the superintendent's office requested our top pick for hire, an African-American man, was to complete extensive and unreasonable assignments that night and to have them due the next day. Overriding the hiring committee, I believe, was an act of discrimination. Our top pick for hire was African-American, and our second pick for hire was Latina. And this is taking a significant risk that special privilege be given to an unlicensed candidate. Superintendent Morris wrote to the community that Patty Bodie was the interim principal for the middle school for the 2018-2019 school year. But Dr. Bodie does not have an administrative license, which is required for the permanent position. In fact, a license is required for an interim principal as well, pursuant to Chapter 71. No person that should be eligible for employment as a teacher unless some licensure has been granted. A waiver can be granted, but only if the search has been deemed to fail, and also that the first and second candidates are deemed unqualified.
It's 3 minutes and 17 seconds.
Okay, I'm not done now.
That's the length of the comment period.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Lesdowski. I'm a member of the School Equity Task Force, and I can either pick up reading or seek my time, my 3 minutes.
Why don't you cede your time?
I see my time.
Waivers are in place for districts as an absolute last resort hardship, not as a loophole to help advance friends in their careers. The waiver is not guaranteed this upcoming school year, and having no waiver would be illegal as Ms. Bodie is not licensed. The public should understand this, that interim principals all must be licensed or waivered. In 2016, Ms. Bodie was hired. No waiver or license was ever filed with DESE. This is problematic as the law was broken that year, an entire school year of suspensions, expulsions, and any teacher paperwork that resulted in termination can now be called into question. The implications of these actions are that bias has been given towards Ms. Bodie. Privilege is that if The process proceeds must now be granted to any other educator who wants to be endorsed for administration, licensed or unlicensed. I have no personal issue with Ms. Bodie nor Mr. Morris. I'm simply questioning the integrity of the process. Conflict of interest law describes a misuse of an official position, or a municipal employee should not be using their position to help someone else that's not properly, a position that's not properly given and available to other similarly situated individuals. My concern is that significant privileges have been granted to an unlicensed Caucasian woman over qualified licensed educators who also happen to be of color. While this appears to be a conflict of interest, and any person in the community that would improperly see a public official being improperly influenced, public disclosure of facts must be offered. 3 years in a row, qualified licensed candidates have been overlooked, which violates DESE's laws. The parents of children who were suspended or expelled should be notified, as this first year of 2016 is akin to an educational malpractice. Should she obtain her license via this non-conventional path, it must be the same path offered to every other educator who requests making this transition to administration going forward, or a case for bias can always also be made. Hiring committees should not be assembled to DESE to give the appearance that a search occurred. Deep resentments and further divides occur when people of color witness this, as if words like multicultural education can be used for a Caucasian person's resume, but when asked to make decisions, their voice is overridden, and when applying for positions of power, no matter how long the list of their qualifications, they will be passed over for a Caucasian person with no minimum qualifications, as defined by DESE, not by Amherst, with allowances that would be made for no other person. I request the hiring search committee continue and the integrity restored in this process.
Thanks. Are there further public comments? Again, state your name, and I'd prefer it if people could keep to the 3 minutes.
Sure.
I'm not
Yeah, mine is
criticizing
gonna be
anyone, I'm
quite
just
short.
saying, please try.
Hi, my name is Caridad Martinez Echevarria, and I am a member of the School Equity Task Force. And I've been on that Equity Task Force for quite a few years. I'm also in collaboration with a few other educators and psychiatrists and psychologists, also offer our services to serve as educational advocates for children on IEPs and for families and children who are caught up in what we call the school to prison pipeline. And we try to advocate for them in that space. So about 3 weeks ago, I wrote a very strong letter to the administration, and I copied several people in the community. And in that letter, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but in that letter, what I'm requesting is a moratorium, right, on all expulsions, suspensions, and any kind of police activity in the middle school and in the high school, but mostly in the middle school. Because we have information that I'm not going to disclose now, but we have information that there are the police is coming in and children are being criminalized for things like verbal altercations. And, we have not fought for as long as we have fought for a restorative justice program for this to continue happening, not under the watchful eye of the community. The only reason we know these things is because either I have gods and goddesses that direct me to where I need to go because it's not public. I just happen to either bump into people or people call me and they say this is what's happening. And these people are willing to come forward. So I'm requesting a moratorium until there's an investigation into this. And if this is what is brought up today regarding the principalship is true, then even more so. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there further public comments?
Hello, my name is Sonja Johnson Anderson. I am a member of the community. And I just, some years ago, we had to struggle to help a teacher who was victimized in the school system to gain some measure of justice. And there were different players at the time, but I am dismayed to say that the game has remained the same. And we need to bring real change to our school district. And if we are sitting serving the public as representatives of the public, duly elected representatives of the public, then the public's interest needs to be served. And so I would implore the committee to please look into these disturbing allegations, as I'm hearing them, concerning the hiring of administrators for our students in our school district that our tax dollars pay for. And so thank you all for your service. And I would continue to support your efforts as long as those efforts are put towards seeing justice and rightness done. Thank you.
Vera Dwangmani Cage. I live in Amherst, and I just want to mention the work that Dr. Morris is involved in with the racial imbalance committee through the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and I think we should really look into that and see if we, in our own institution here, are practicing, best practices. And, the concerns that have been raised by Ms. Harmon is concerning, and I implore every single school committee member and student school committee member to investigate and to have the school district be transparent and come forward with the information and the facts as much as possible so that public confidence can be restored. Thank you.
Any further public comments? Okay, come on up.
It's good to see some old friends and neighbors and townspeople. Chairman Nakajima. My name is Trevor Baptiste from Pelham, the immediate previous past chair of this committee. It's great to see new people on the committee willing to give service. I first got on the school committee when my son, my oldest, my firstborn, was in kindergarten, with the express purpose of, unashamedly, having an influence on the school system so that it wouldn't hurt my child. I am sorry to say that when I got behind the scenes, I saw a lot of influences that I went through a lot of battles and trials to try to reverse and make sure it would be safe for my child and safe for my townspeople and friends and neighbors. I forgot to mention too, in case you don't know this about me, I have a firm, fervent belief in democracy, in people being civically engaged and taking over what is theirs and not being preached to of how things are supposed to be when it's yours. Towards that end, next year, my son begins in middle school. I am sorry to say that some of the same things that I've seen through my tenure continue in terms of folks being given the hand and being prevented from trying to control their system when it's their system. I've been through a lot of battles, and I wear this hat because I've won a lot of them. I won battles to make sure people like Vera could get on the school committee. I won battles to ensure I considered it a win that we could have a position for an equity director. I would consider it a loss if an equity director's position was to find a new principal and that was overturned. And I hope I'm not speaking about anybody's particular position. I'm saying that systematically, I'm talking to you directly, Chairperson. Systematically, I would consider a loss. That would be my work in vain if I spent a lot of toil to make sure there was an equity director that could have a search that could be responsive to the community, and that was overturned out of hand. Been through a lot of battles with unelected administrators who, for whatever reasons, there were people were too slow to check. So I implore you, friends, neighbors, folks who are elected to represent, to not be slow with responding to what the community describes they need. Please don't let the wins that I have battled with some of you guys with go in vain. That's it.
Thank you. Any further public comments?
My name is Carolyn Gardner, and I am a member of the community, former teacher at Amherst High School. I got into the high school, I was recruited, got into high school as a person of color, and was forced out. And it's appalling to me that I am hearing from this letter that we have qualified people of color coming in and through some process that is, in my understanding, not quite transparent, that these people of color are not given a full chance. From the letter that I'm now hearing for the first time, the candidates that are qualified that are being overlooked for candidates that are not. History is repeating itself, folks. Different people, same problem. We've got to fix it. And if you do not fix it, you will hear from the community. Thank you.
Any further public comments? Okay, public, oh, I'm sorry, no, I wasn't trying to gavel you down, I just didn't see you.
My name is Kathleen Anderson. I'm a former school committee for the town of Amherst and a regional school committee member. I've been in this district since 2000. I served on the Becoming a Multicultural School System Committee, and I'm aware of the social justice commitment document that educators in Amherst spent many hours creating that has gone unacknowledged and unused. I have been an employee in the district, in the high school, in the middle school, in each of the elementary schools. I have also been a facilitator for social justice in the school for professional, in the school district for professional development. I am being very patient, but I am outraged that this district even has anybody representing on the, what is it called? The Inequity Committee? The Racial Imbalance Committee. How is that possible? When what this school district does, historically has done, is run people of color out of the district. There is no example that any educator in this school district has to support or sustain people of color in an environment like this.
Are there any further public comments? So I'm going to close the public comment period. Oh, I'm sorry. You know what? That's what I need to do. Well, I need to pick up the gavel. Once I do that, then I know who the public next comment is going to be.
Hi, I'm Susan Chaberish. I live in Amherst, and I have two children who attended the schools. I've been involved since, I don't know, the early 80s in looking at these issues. You know, I do think we have a cultural problem here. It goes on and on. You know, there's so many things that I could say. It's hard to know where to start, but this issue of understanding how to deal with middle school children and issues around expelling children from school, you know, I take that very, very seriously. 13-year, you know, young children, 14, 15, that age, and I'm trying to process that this is actually happening. I mean, I worked in a college setting. I was on many a hiring committee. I ran a graduate program for school counselors, and I'm trying to figure it out, because the first thing we have to do is there are, you know, you meet with HR and there are minimum qualifications. And people have to meet minimum qualifications. They're not, we weren't allowed to consider people who didn't meet minimum qualifications, there's 2 piles, and that's it. Minimum qualifications don't meet minimum qualifications. So on that level, I'm trying to understand. I don't get it, because that's not how it happens. It's in public institutions. And I guess also I want to say, as somebody who, directed a school counselor program, wow, our school counselors go through a lot of training, school psychologists go through a lot of training, teachers do, administrators do. There's all kinds of nuances. I mean, it was, I'm very aware of the work that people have to do on themselves to become effective school counselors. And I guess I don't get it, like with all the incredibly qualified people and qualified people of color. I guess I don't understand how we have somebody who's not, I don't understand how this happened. My mind is reeling, okay? I guess, and here we all are again. And I'm telling you, we've been here so many times, and here we are again. And this time, we have new people on the committee. Some of you don't know that we keep showing up, when there's injustice. So I hope you're hearing us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Abigail Morris. I'm a senior at the school. I don't know a ton about what's going on with this, but I do know, I'm white, obviously, but I know that my friends and I know that our teachers don't look like our students. The teachers, I don't know about the other schools, but in the high school, our teachers, they don't reflect who we are as, a student body. They reflect who I am. I'm white. I'm a woman. I'm queer. All of those things exist in my teachers. But, my friends who are people of color, they don't see that in their teachers. And, I don't know what's going on, but it sounds pretty messed up. I know it's a lot of adults here and, parents. And, I know most of my friends don't know about this, but tomorrow they're going to know about it. And they know that their teachers are white. I don't know. I just want to say that.
Well said.
Okay, I'm gonna close public. We also have to move on too, but I'm going to welcome another comment if there was one, of course. For members of the committee, now you know I introduced this topic by saying we don't engage in a dialogue or answer questions. It's also helpful for the public as well, because given the public comments, it would be a natural question as to what happens next, and that point would be the committee will figure out what's next later. Are there any announcements by the committee? Mr. Demlin.
Yeah, I wanted to give an update on the charter school expansion effort, the opposition to the charter school expansion that we've been working on for the last year. So the board ruled on March 27th to uphold the commissioner's decision to not approve the expansion of PVC-ICS. So just, you probably all know this from the news, but just a couple of points wanted to share. So one I thought it was good that for the second time they upheld the board's decision, the commissioner's decision. The other thing is there was a bit of quite a bit of frustration expressed by the board that the school had been coming back with the same size level of expansion. The commissioner, when he introduced the topic, talked about how charter schools need to be right-sized, and in this, especially in the part of the state with declining enrollment, to sort of briefly touched on that issue. The chairman of the board expressed frustration, and the associate director of charters expressed frustration about trying to come up with a growth plan for the charter school and not being on the same page with the school. So that was good. So I feel like the kind of expansion that we've been looking at for the last couple of years of the school, doubling in size, is at the moment a non-starter. So that's good. The thing that was pretty concerning, and I'll try to keep this brief, is that we presented very clearly, both in our letter and when I spoke at public comment, reiterated the demographic imbalances. This is the underserving of every high-need subgroup, English language learners, special education, low income, African American, Hispanic, everyone. And we showed how large the short under-enrollment is and how consistent it's been. And the board expressed no concern in their deliberations. Their deliberations were all about right-sizing the expansion. What was particularly chilling for me to hear was when the school was talking about their explanations as to why these shortfalls aren't problems. And I won't go into every one because we've been over them. One of the examples they use is, well, you don't put kids with disabilities on IEPs if they're making progress, as one of the reasons for why their numbers in special education were so low. And to anybody with a rudimentary understanding of special education IEPs, it was really impactful to hear that, and then to hear the board not push back on that at all. It made me think about, not just a soapbox here, but to think about, in the future when we fight these battles, this particular one and more broadly the charter school privatization push, we're going up against an educational force where there are people in positions of power in education who don't care that there are schools that don't serve all the students in our community. And so I think our challenge in terms of messaging isn't just to make the good data argument and logic and impact the local schools, but to really show that public education is something we value in terms of servicing all students, and that it's not okay for a public school to under-enroll our highest need students. And so I think that's our challenge. I think that the hope is that I think that support is there in the public, and so our challenge is how do we create a message that resonates with the public that then influences the board. So
Thanks. Any other announcements? Seeing none, we'll move to subcommittee updates. And I know the superintendent's evaluation subcommittee met earlier. Who drew the long or short straw to be the spokesperson?
Well, I can do it because I
Yeah.
took probably the better notes, or the only notes. So we met chiefly to look at the possible timeline for the evaluation this year.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were trying to balance a timeline that's reasonable with being able to capture the voices that are present currently who have been serving. So I can go into more detail on that part if you want, but basically kind of what we landed on would be it's kind of an optimistic, aggressive timeline, where on our May 8th regional meeting, Dr. Morris would present artifacts and the evaluation would open. And we could have a 2-week window for members to fill out the evaluation, having the evaluation close on May 22nd, which I think is also a meeting date of ours. Then by rearranging the Pelham schedule, we could have a regional meeting on June 5th to hold the evaluation, the public evaluation and the vote, which would then allow for goal setting at the late June meeting, or at least presenting the goals for next year. So that schedule would allow all the small towns, current reps to participate.
Right, more or less. So the thinking was that.
More or less.
Well,
I'm sorry to laugh, I apologize.
Leverett and Shutesbury will have voted. Neither Steve nor I happen to be up for re-election this year, so the chances that we do not come back to the region are very slim. So we can push beyond the town meeting dates of Leverett and Shutesbury, but not Pelham, because they're not seeking re-election. So their election's on the 15th. If we open evaluations on May 8th, it allows them to do the evaluation before the 15th for them when they are no longer members, and gives us a little extra time to actually do the voting. So they would have a say in their voice would be heard in the evaluation, though they wouldn't vote on it. So it's sort of a compromise.
Mr. Dunlap?
So I'm just kind of asking the chair, because I think you probably understand this better than I do.
Sure.
So does that run up against what we discovered before, which is if you're not on the committee, you can't contribute to because if the vote's not until the 22nd, we have data and we have written input from people who are not on the committee can that be part of the eval?
I would, I think two things. I think, one, before we make a firm decision on this, we should run that by our attorney. But the nature, when Mark Terry had presented his emails on the subject, he said that someone who is sitting as, essentially it's binary, either on the committee or not. So if you have members on the committee who are filling out evaluations on April 1st, then anyone who's a committee member on April 1st can fill out evaluations. If on April 15th you're voting the evaluations and those people are no longer on it, people who are on the committee, even if they didn't do the earlier written evaluations, can vote, and they can vote regardless of whether they actually contributed anything in writing. Those people who did contribute writing cannot vote, regardless of the fact that they were members when they filled out their writing. So I think the rule is just sort of an absolute, the switch is on, it's either a 1 or a 0, and right, nothing else. And so I think the answer is that would work, but we'll double check before we do it, obviously.
Right. It's sort of a compromise of getting everybody's opinion, voice heard.
Yeah.
And not putting extreme pressure on the superintendent, though it's a pretty aggressive schedule.
When's our next meeting?
May.
It's May 8th. I don't think
Our
it's
next meeting is May 8th? Really?
Yeah, because of school
Isn't it?
vacation.
Yeah, and then it is an Amherst meeting on the 24th and a Pelham meeting on the 1st.
Who's doing this?
So I think the obvious question is whether Dr. Morris thinks that he can pull together all the artifacts and everything that we would need by our next meeting, by May 8th. So,
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, this came up in, the subcommittee invited me to be part of the discussion, and I'm a little concerned about that, but I weigh that concern with the concern about Pelham not having any representation in the evaluation process, which is a possible outcome if it's not on May 8th, and that feels worse to me. So I'd rather err on that side than to eliminate one town's ability to participate in the evaluation process. So,
Okay.
one of the member towns, excuse me.
okay.
Is there anything else from the committee, or are there questions, comments?
You can say.
No, what? I mean, what's,
Well, I'm just, so this was, we only met just this evening.
Right.
And so this was a quick discussion, and as I'm thinking about it, I think we could push this back and still capture at least one Pelham voice, because that's not going to switch until Pelham reorganizes. We hadn't really thought about that.
It's true.
So that could give it, some more breathing room to the schedule.
yeah, the reason I asked when the next meeting was and was surprised it was the 8th is because, well, there's two reasons. One, we never go that long without meetings. So it was a completely, that can't possibly be true. Must be one tomorrow. But the other reason is because normally we wouldn't make a decision that fast. Normally, we'd have a subcommittee come back with information. We'd then think about it, kick the tires, and make sure we understood whether there were any other side effects to it that were unknown, and then we'd vote, right, or make a decision. Committee, I mean, this is a mechanical, I think, act in terms of the setting our calendar. Yes.
We have a short meeting on Friday
Mhm.
scheduled.
It's not
If
on the
you-
agenda to discuss this, though.
It might be enough time to amend the agenda.
Actually, I suppose it would be, wouldn't it?
If we felt a few days of thinking about it before making a final decision.
Is the committee okay with that? Then we will do that.
Would you want to have an alternative timeline to think about before Friday?
If the X factor is whether Dr. Morris can feel comfortable putting together the information, then the X factor is whether Dr. Morris feels comfortable. I mean, honestly, this doesn't put particular pressure on us, right, as a committee. It really puts pressure on you. And so I think the point would be if you sleep on it and think that we'd like an alternative, then yes, you'd need to come up with an alternative suggestion.
And I think either way, the subcommittee needs to meet in the next few weeks to put together the questionnaire.
Yeah,
that gets
yeah.
used, so that on the 8th, we would be ready if the board was so inclined to open up evaluations.
Which actually brings me to another question. Does the board want to vote on the instrument? I would imagine so, before we use it. So maybe we can't really
Or-
actually open up on May 8th.
Well,
That's what we're coming to.
Well, we could open it on May 8th if there were no edits required to whatever template we brought
Right,
forward.
but I mean,
Yeah.
if we won't be able to like approve it as a board, which I think would be nice.
I think Ms. Marriott was about to tell us what the timeline was before. Maybe now's the time to do that.
Well,
Oh, you mean an alternative time?
An
You already have
alternative.
one?
No.
I was gonna say, I really.
Calendar.
I can do that,
Yeah.
kind of.
I was gonna say, that's funny, because I was reading the other way. So we have to think about this.
I mean, I think we could just push it all back a meeting,
Mhm.
right? So we have meetings scheduled May 8th and May 22nd, so we could open the evaluation on May 22nd. Dr. Morse could present artifacts on May 22nd, and then we could vote it on the June 12th meeting, and still have the meeting on the 26th to do goal setting for next year.
So I think a couple of variables are, one, what level, in the past, I tried to share a lot of the artifacts with the committee beforehand. I think the 8th, separate from whether I can get it done in the way that I'm comfortable with, I think, the thing I can assure you is that it wouldn't be something that could be sent the Friday before. So I think, I don't know if that matters to the committee, but I want to be clear around expectations of what I think is feasible. I hadn't considered Ms. Marriott's point around that the timeline in Pelham may be not just the election, but also the reorganization, and that is a useful piece of information that was not available to me prior to her saying it. So that's the other thing I'm thinking about.
So since I'm apparently obsessed with the notion that we almost don't have enough meetings on the calendar, is it possible that the door number 3 is that we schedule a meeting specifically for this topic at a different point after May 8th, but before May 22nd? And dead silence from the board. What, yes,
I
please.
guess I'm wondering what the objective of that meeting would be.
To move up the calendar of the, what I was trying to do is try to find a way to actually not, to me, the difference between May 8th and May 22nd sounds like a big difference. You can disagree, I mean,
Well,
sure.
I don't think that it'll make a material difference in the
Okay.
evaluation. I mean, I think the same players will be eligible
Okay.
No,
between May 8th and May.
you wouldn't be able to fill out your evaluation form.
I don't think anytime after May 8th I would be able to, so.
May
Well, I mean-
14th. How's May 14th?
So, I mean,
I
I
don't-
don't think we have to schedule this around me. I'm comfortable if we have at least one strong voice in the mix.
You know, I hate to say this, but I was actually about to make the observation that I'm not comfortable about the ideas of us jerry-rigging our schedule just to accommodate your availability. What I also felt, and it's just my opinion, I'm expressing my opinion, is that the reason I brought it up is if inserting another meeting somewhere to make the meeting flow work better to do this, then let's just schedule another meeting.
Right.
If that's not the case and we're now just doing backflips and contorting ourselves, then let's just do the 22nd and we'll move forward on that schedule. Unless people disagree, but I mean, I was throwing out a trial balloon.
Yeah, I mean, and under any of these situations, it's a little bit, less than ideal in that the committee that's voting on the evaluation, there will be a reasonable number of people who will not have had very much time on the committee.
Mm-hmm.
But in any situation, we are stuck with that situation.
Yeah,
So.
I think that's true. So do you want to still move forward with the ratifying some decision on Friday? Mr. Gilman?
Yes.
Okay, then let's just do that. So let's move on.
Just a brief note to our new members. Ms. Westmoreland did an excellent job capturing our discussion of this last meeting in the minutes we just approved. It's in our packet, and there's a couple of good sentences about what we had, because we talked a long time about new members, about new member participation and all that, so I thought that was helpful.
It is helpful. It's also one of the reasons why I'm now given her understanding of the process and the law, I'm less troubled about. I mean, I've come to a point of peace and acceptance that there's literally no calendar that exists that doesn't exclude some current member or some recent past member from being able to do the evaluation. And so we've got to live with it and just come up with something that feels workable. We have, and I shouldn't laugh about this, but we just spent an awful lot of time talking about this in previous meetings. Okay, next, superintendent's update.
Sure. Given that we've got a fair bit of agenda,
Yeah.
I'll try to be brief. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of the things on here and one thing that I've neglected to add. So the second one, well, I'm going to actually mention all of them briefly, and then one more. So last week was the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, and so a bunch of stuff happened to other schools, but just note that at the high school, student read a statement over the PA at the beginning of the school day, followed by an all-school moment of silence in honor of Dr. King's work. Also on the 4th at the university, this is not on your piece of paper, UMass had Dr. John King, who was the former Secretary of Education under President Obama, speak, and actually a number of district staff members, including myself, attended, and then Mr. Mangano and I actually got to have dinner with a group with him afterwards. It was very powerful. What stuck with me was the focus on, there's a lot of political wrangling at the state level, at the federal level, and how do we shift those debates into kid-focused debates and student-focused debates instead of politically focused debates. And he's a very inspiring life story and a very inspiring speaker. Autism Awareness Month. Here, you may have seen that if you've been, and there's a lot of things that I'm not going to read everything on here, but the Family Diversity Project is focused on portraits of people with disabilities. And tomorrow night, Thursday night at the high school library, the CPAC and the regional schools are partnering on Autism Awareness Night. Started last year, where students who were comfortable enough shared their stories. We talked about it here last year, but just incredibly powerful event as well to hear from some of our students and how they experience the world and the school world, and what's helpful for them. So just if people can make it, it is really appreciate CPAC's work on that. Health insurance, there's been 10. I attended one this afternoon, informational sessions about potential changes to employee health insurance plans. I really want to thank Jennifer Ortiz, who works in our Human Resources Department. Sean has also been at many of them, but Ms. Ortiz has a large role in presenting both about the changes and also about, she's in charge of enrollment, so there's a lot of enrollment questions, like I had one myself as an employee today. And so you can imagine that any change to people's insurance, however large or small, comes with lots of questions, and everyone needs to be re-enrolled. So she's got a lot of work on her hand, but she's communicated very effectively with school staff. I want to thank her for that. Just an update on the Summit Academy move. This one's tomorrow night. There's an event for families, and Principal Slovin's hosting that, just getting ready for the move. Mr. Jackson talked about this at the early release day last week, and a joint committee of staff has been formed to try to think through that transition. So if you think back to when this was presented, I know one of the questions the school committee had is, so if this goes forward, what's the plan around transition? And that's really what a lot of the work has happened. What's not on here is the level of work that Mr. McPherson's done on the facility side. We have been in touch with the state about the move. That was one of the questions, and they're comfortable with us moving forward. They do want to do a site visit once the school's up and running, and the big thing that they shared was that the separation really needs to be a separation. It can't be a kind of quasi-separation where kids are back and forth unless it's indicated on students' IEPs. So it was a really helpful clarifying piece of information, but Mr. McPherson's ordering supplies, materials, and as you can see in the couple pages below, if you like looking at schematics or understand them well, you can start seeing exactly what some of the changes will be, and it's tried to be color-coded to be clear, so I appreciate Mr. McPherson's work on this as well.
Zero on this.
Just a question about that point that you just made, Dr. Morris, in terms of making sure students are kept separate. So how does that impact like recess and lunch or things like that, where students may be, interacting with each other more
Right,
regularly?
at the secondary level, certainly lunch and classes,
Mhm.
courses. We do have students who do take courses, have historically taken courses at the high school. It's a little bit challenging transportation, which has been a barrier. So really, all that's filtered through the IEP process, and that was the helpful clarifier, is that if students are eating lunch in the cafeteria or taking a science class outside Summit Academy, that has to be indicated very clearly on an IEP. It can't be done without a team meeting and an accepted IEP that indicates as such. So it puts formality to the process, which frankly I think is a good thing, so that everybody's clear on what the plan is for every child at Summit Academy. I think the potential for integration is no different than what we spoke about earlier. It's just the process by which those decisions are made will be formalized through an IEP process instead of a more casual approach.
Further?
Just a question on the general class. How many classrooms are devoted to Summit Academy?
Mr. Sullivan was still here. I saw him earlier because he could speak to us better. But in general, it's 5. But what you'll find when you look at the space is there's a lot of rooms that are subdivided for counselors, therapists, principal, and really importantly, a space that's not a classroom for students to congregate in. One of the true kind of values that the school has is around community. It's a small community, and it's a community that spends a lot of time working through positive events and working through challenges collectively. And so you can't necessarily do that in the classroom. So that was really integral to the thinking of the design, was how do we have classroom spaces for instruction, how do we have therapeutic spaces, and then how do we have gathering spaces where that community aspect that's been such a treasure at the current site would continue into a new site.
Further questions? Is there anyone else?
Just one more, just in terms of the transition, the committee that's been formed. We had talked before about incorporating students into that.
Right.
So I don't know if that's made any progress or.
I will get back to you. I've
Okay.
been hearing much more about the planning on the staff end and less about the student end. I imagine that'll come up tomorrow night at the meeting for families and students, but I can shoot the committee an email response for that.
Great, thank you.
I happened to talk to Mr. Sullivan earlier, and he said school committee members were welcome to come to the drop-in tomorrow.
Thank you.
And, sorry, I meant to say Autism Awareness Night, which is Thursday night.
Yep.
So I went to that last year. So I've been on the committee about a year now. The 2 most impactful events I've been to are that and the Summit Academy graduation. So I can't recommend them highly enough. They were like, I mean, and I have a son with autism, and to me it was still like world opening, So the students and the teachers do such an amazing job of just communication and engagement. It's not just like a talkie, sitting in the back of the room, stay it kind of affair. So it was excellent.
The last one I'll just keep briefly. This is a topic that's come up for this body, that this morning Mr. Margano and I actually were both at the MARS meeting, the Massachusetts Association of Regional Schools. That's my typo, I apologize. Not all the regional schools are rural, although most are. And so there was a group of superintendents, there was one school committee representative, and the MARS staff, and there was an agenda item that I asked to be added that they graciously offered around advocacy for regional school budgets and regional school transportation. Given that the House budget is supposed to come in tomorrow, we emphasized the importance of reaching out to local legislators. And there's people from Eastern Mass as well as Western Mass. I think there's a perception that regional schools are only a Western Mass phenomenon. I can tell you from where the locations happen for MARS, that is not true, because they're more often not in the 413 area code. And it was a lot of genuine agreement. There was some disagreement on the advocacy, what percentage should be advocated for. Should we advocate for full reimbursement or somewhere in between full and where we are now? So there was a lot of really good dialogue on the topic, but there was high levels of engagement of the superintendents and the staff who were there. So I do feel like there was a commitment on those who were present to follow up with phone calls and emails to legislators and a genuine understanding, and MARS staff were able to help with this on the legislative process as well.
Anything further from the committee for the superintendent before we move along? And We have miles to go before we sleep in. Nothing on the chair's report. We're obviously going to have to talk about school committee planning and planning upcoming meetings later, which are obviously relevant to the chair's role. First item of new and continuing business is strategic planning, and I would appreciate it actually, Dr. Morris, in addition to introducing Dr. Nusad in any presentation or discussion we're going to have, is to also contextualize a little bit, I mean, not for a long bit, but briefly, contextualize for all the current members, meaning those who've been here for a while, those who are new, what we're doing and how this fits.
Sure. So we had conversations throughout the spring and fall about engaging in a strategic planning effort that was community engaged and focused that way, so that when we came up with superintendent goals, things like that, and district direction, we heard from a broad group of stakeholders and had real clear vision of the district's work for the next 3 to 5 years, and it's not kind of changing each year, but really a long-range plan and then narrow specific steps along the way to get there. And so we were planning to work on this in the fall and winter, get it started, I should say, in the fall and winter. We'd engaged Dr. Musad. He came to our meeting, I think it was in August, all the way back then. And then the budget hit. And what I was concerned about, and we talked about here, was starting a process to engage faculty, community, when we were in the throes of, at some moments it looked like more than $2 million of budget cuts at the regional level. And so I was concerned about the engagement, the space for engagement that was present. A lot of people here, a lot of staff members were spending a tremendous amount of time working, not just on the budget documents, but working with local representatives and elected officials in the 4-member towns. So we sort of put a pause on that process, and now that we're through, we have a voted school committee budget, and we'll have town meetings coming up in the near future. Tried to re-engage the work with Dr. Musad. Dr. Musad met with our administrative team last week or the week before to think about that, and really what my intention, I'll just finish this sentence, is that to re-engage, as people have noted, there's new members who haven't met Dr. Musad, and to re-engage the timeline and the process and the work ahead now that we're kind of formally out of the school committee budget season. That took a little longer and was a little more intense than typical years.
Yeah, and let me add a little more context to that, because I think it's helpful. When we actually first started this conversation, it was actually quite a while ago, and it was over a year ago. And the intention was, and this at that point, we did not know, and it was not necessarily foreseeable that Dr. Morris was in fact going to be our permanent superintendent. And so the initial thought was to basically to create a baseline through community engagement, data, rich sort of interaction that was actually free, which had a virtue to it, was free from the idea that this level of community exploration and engagement was going to directly lead to an immediate plan where, in other words, Dr. Morris would listen and then immediately go off into a room by himself, scribble away on a computer, and come out with a plan. It was actually, we thought there was such a virtue to the idea that it was likely that it was possible an entire another superintendent was going to take that summary of the community engagement and then build a 3 to 5 year strategic plan around that, which should then be incorporated in annual superintendent goal setting. Obviously, that's another reason, frankly, for the delay before the budget hit. And so the virtue now is that we have a process in which we can do the community engagement. But as you've seen in the materials, there's a 2-step part, but going from that community engagement process directly into the development of a 3 to 5 year, whatever it is, plan. Right?
That's helpful. I'm sorry I neglected to say that.
So, anything else?
I think other than introducing Dr. Musad, and if I could ask you to introduce yourself again, because not everyone here has seen you or met you. And
are we putting anything on the overheads? No?
I think it's just what's in the packet is my understanding. And I think, from my vantage point, the goal tonight is to look through the timeline, kind of reorient ourselves to some of the work, and offer feedback to both myself and Dr. Musad on steps forward. Those are the kind of 3 things that I hope in this time we're able to do.
Please.
So good evening. Am I using this correctly? Good.
It's probably best not to touch it too much unless you got it set.
Okay. Does that work? Good evening. My name is Albert Musad. I'm a leadership and instruction consultant at the Collaborative for Educational Services. I am a seasoned educator, a teacher and school administrator in New Jersey public schools, in Western Massachusetts now for 4 years, providing professional development and other technical services to public schools across the Commonwealth. It's been my privilege, prior to this engagement related to strategic planning, to work in the Amherst Regional Schools with English teachers of English as a second language, providing professional development. And I contributed to a review of the district's use of interpreters or translators for students using English as an additional language in content area classes other than ESL. I engaged, Dr. Morris reached out to our executive director, and I began this engagement with several drafts of a timeline and a process that has been revised to reflect the circumstances that Mr. Nakajima and Dr. Morris have both described. And I am delighted that we are ready to move forward. And as you've heard from both folks, an initial commitment to strong input and solicitation of that input from various constituencies from the community. From the very beginning, the conversation really was anchored in the intention and commitment of the community and of the school committee, the superintendent, and of this process to engage deeply and significantly various constituencies of the community. I understand that you have the timeline in front of you, and if you have questions or you would appreciate an overview, whatever is your bidding, I'm happy to respond to this evening.
Mr. Devlin?
So I think one of the main challenges when trying to engage the public on something that's so high level and general and broad is to just give an understanding of what the scope is, because I think the initial reaction is that the scope is everything. And so without something that people can really sink their teeth into, the tendency can be for people to be all over the place, and it could be good input, but at every level and every topic. So I think talk a little bit about how do you take public attention and give them an idea of, okay, this is what we're doing, so that people are talking at the level that we need to be talking.
Sure. So the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has adopted a process called Planning for Success, which I believe information about that process was provided. And the school committee and the superintendent have decided to adopt that particular process, which is flexible, right? So it's not a rigid process. But precisely to your question, it starts with a protocol first to welcome constituencies, members of various constituencies to a larger body called a planning team. There is a smaller body called the leadership team, which is the superintendent and the folks whom he designates to serve on that team, which would be a team of people who would be responsible for really implementation of action plans to carry out the strategic plan. The planning team is comprised of a wider range of constituencies, which also necessarily includes the leadership team because of their implementation role. And then begins with a protocol that asks folks through a series of questions to think about what they envision from the school district and how we got there. So there are a series of questions to get folks to think about, in 3 years or 5 years, what does the Amherst Regional Pelham School District look like? What do you see? What do you hear? What does it feel like? What steps did we take to get there? And there are a couple of other prompts in that. There is also another protocol that asks folks to consider the school community's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, a protocol you might be familiar with. That is another way of getting folks to articulate their experiences, both, I'll say, subjective and objective in the schools. And then there is a process of taking all of that data and identifying recurrent themes. So to your point, it's not everything that is mentioned, but where do we see recurrent themes? And then we engage the planning team in identifying the most frequent, most important, that's the themes that seem to be most pressing. And it's from those themes that we then engage the development, through a protocol, of strategic objectives. And it's the strategic objectives that become the foundation. Before that, identifying outcomes for the school community over 3 or 5 years. And from those outcomes emerge objectives, initiatives, and then annual action plans.
Thank you.
There are other questions?
I have,
Yes.
and I know we talked about this a long time ago, but I think it might be important to reiterate.
Sure.
Sort of the broad range of people we want to engage in this process and the means by which we will engage them. Maybe we could just sort of review that quickly.
So yes, let me start with yes. The superintendent and I imagine in concert with the school committee, identified a list of constituencies, which I happen to have handy. You may have it as well. For the record, I could read the list if that's useful. It includes members of the Amherst Regional School staff, which is the middle school, the high school, and Summit Academy. And I should say that this list has been revised, and was revised in my recent meeting with the leadership team and Dr. Morris, the administration, as well as licensed educators and paraprofessionals. Then ELL parents and guardians, school councils and PGOs, Amherst, Pelham, Leverett, and Shutesbury elementary school staff, ARPS school committee, the APEA executive board, CETIF, I don't know what all these acronyms mean yet, but I will learn them. Amherst Education Foundation, CPAC, the ARPS Family Center, ARMS and ARHS students, and town officials, specifically select boards and finance committees. Also, I understand that Dr. Guevara serves as director of the Family Center, we also have an administrator and committee responsible for equity initiatives. And I'm imagining that the school committee, in partnership with the superintendent, with the leadership team, with Dr. Guevara, will use their connections to begin to reach out. And I understand, particularly from Principal Slovin, that he already has indicated some interest from his staff. So I am imagining that the outreach effort has begun to identify among this range of constituencies individuals who might be interested and available to serve on the planning committee. And at the request of Dr. Morris and the leadership team, I provided some specific guidance and tools that might be useful to them in that effort, and we're underway.
And then I guess my other question would
Sure.
be maybe for Dr. Morris, which is if there are people in the community that are passionate about this and would like to be involved, who should they contact?
Yeah, thank you. I think Ms. Westmoreland and/or me would be the logical answer, and kind of one of the things that we talked about with the leadership team was just engaging staff, and I know some of the principals have started that process, and there was a letter that went out from Mr. Nakajima and myself last Friday. That's more an introductory overview. If you look at this timeline, it's really about getting the initial message out. And as we get more into deeper levels of engagement, there'll be additional messaging to encourage that. And as Dr. Musad said, working with the Family Center, particularly on linguistically diverse families, families who may have more challenges getting to a specific place at a specific time, and how do we do outreach where people are instead of just always where we are. So that's some of the dialogue that we had, I think it was last week.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other, before any other questions? Oh, Sunis.
So just in looking through this, I mean, I think it's great that we're engaging this process, and I like the idea of having sort of multi-year goals that we're identifying ahead of time. I think just to echo Mr. Demling's earlier question and just the way that I think about this kind of stuff, this is a very complicated kind of process. You know, I worked in philanthropy for a while, and this is very similar to the kind of evaluation measures that you would take, right, and, you know, sort of the typical grant-making cycle. And, you know, it's difficult for, I think, the everyday person to take a bite of this and understand why we're even engaging this. So I think it'll be really important for us to be able to articulate in very simple language why this is an important process for us to be taking at this point in time, and to really bring people along slowly for that purpose, and not expect that anyone will really be super committed or excited or even interested in what this is, quite frankly. And I think, you know, once it's explained to them, I think they can get that way. But I think we can't assume that that will just happen, because maybe having, you know, opening up, you know, meetings to the public and expecting them to attend when they don't understand what it is that they're going to be attending and why it matters, you just won't get the attendance, right? So, you know, I think, you know, one thing that might be helpful, even in just for the way that, you know, we're engaging this too, is in having some sort of like outline or breakdown that explains to the school committee, that explains to staff and educators what the ultimate goals are, just, you know, very basic outline before we dig in, you know, and it could be something as simple as, you know, what do you envision success for our students, right? Like, how do you envision this moving, you know, a community moving forward to improve education? Things like that are kind of 30,000-foot level, because, you know, I have a difficult time seeing how people will get excited about this unless they understand that it will have some general impact on their students and in their lives on a regular basis.
You know, before I recognize it, Demling, I'm going to jump in with my two-second thought on that too, with the piggybacking on what Ms. Adonia said. If you wanted to take a trip to the Grand Canyon, you might need, and if you're not going to fly there, you might need a car to drive there. But the problem is, on some level, when you're engaging this is like a schematic of an engine, or of like the electrical system of a car. And so you say like, oh, well, I need an electrical system and an engine for a car. It's like, yeah, but what are you trying to do? Well, I'm trying to take a trip to the Grand Canyon. And it's not very well said. You said it better
Great
than I did.
metaphor.
But the point of the point of the metaphor, no, seriously, the point of the metaphor, though, is the reason why I introduced this whole thing, piggybacking off the superintendent, of saying we're trying to get to the point that we have durable 3 to 5 year strategies that we revisit, we embed our annual goals for the school committee as well as for the superintendent, and by the way, those two things are distinguishable, into what we're doing. Is, in my mind, that is what we're actually trying to do. And so this process is really just one particular set of tools or map that allows us to get to that goal. The goal itself then is obviously, the real goal and vision ultimately is populated with all sorts of things we want for our school, for our kids and our families. But the bottom line is, it's useful to have a strategy. And in fact, one of the things that I kept hearing when I came in is that either we had one or we didn't, or we did, but it isn't revisited, and it's not, I'm not trying to revisit history and be critical. I'm just simply saying what it was clear to me was that we needed to set up a process. So my point being, piggybacking off Ms. Adonia's, is that, and this is actually less on you, Dr. Masad, than it is on us here in the district, is we need to be able to have sort of a simple point of what are we trying to get to and accomplish, and then have this sort of nested into it. I'm sorry, Mr. Demling. That was more than his 2 seconds.
No, that's fine. So I've actually driven to the Grand Canyon recently, so I have experience.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, that's not,
there you go.
No, but what I wanted to say was, so yes, +1 with the things that the both of you just said, and that I think starting, when you're talking to the community about this, describing where it is that you're ending up. So what does this all driving towards, we want to end up with superintendent goals and school committee goals. Like, why should I get a babysitter and go out to this meeting tonight? Oh, because it's going to influence the superintendent's goals. Oh, that's important to me. Okay, I think so that helps. The other concern I wanted to bring up, and I've talked about this a little bit before with Dr. Morris, is this idea of attention demand and initiative overload. So being mindful that this is not an Amherst meeting. You know, most of our families are from Amherst, and just at the Amherst level, you know, we have other very major initiatives going on this calendar year. You know, the dual language / school teams, the regional school district planning board, which may regionalize K-6 Amherst Pelham. That's a huge thing we want a lot of engagement on. The Fort River feasibility study, which while limited in scope, has a lot of community interest. Our government is changing completely. So there's a huge cognitive overload already on the people that we're going to want to come out. And I worry a little bit about how much seconds of the day people have to engage on this. And, you know, so that aside, I think there's ways to try and make that efficient in terms of making us being really proactive about a central place for information, being crystal clear about timelines, pulsing things out on PGO blogs and such, but it is a pretty major concern when I look at the whole plate of changes.
Yeah, so 3 things on that. One is that I've shared that with Dr. Musad, and this timeline perhaps still we need to look at the ambitiousness of it, but it's stretched out from what would be a typical timeline for most communities, partially because of the reasons you shared. I think the second thing is that I think getting anyone's attention on something like the points that were raised around strategic planning, even superintendent goals, for much of the community, the connection between, frankly, district goals, superintendent goals, and what my kids experience is not entirely clear. For some people disagree, and there's definitely people who would be interested, but I can't say the majority would see that as like, ooh, that's a draw. So I think, I don't disagree with anything that people said, but framing is in, how do we use this process to define goals that are going to influence the students, as opposed to the people here tonight, Abigail excluded, and John, sorry, Jack, you know, perhaps would be a reframing that might engender more involvement. I think finally, in terms of some of the elementary, and one could argue the same about Pelham, and I'm sure Shrewsbury Leverett, one thing that I'm continually amazed at, and perhaps it's because I have a larger, no one needs to know this, but I have a larger than perhaps typical gap between my 2 children's ages, is that for families who are in the elementary schools, they're really focused on the elementary schools. For families who are in the secondary level, they remember the elementary schools fondly, and they're fully engaged in the secondary school. So we have this artificial governance distinction, you know, and it's not like that. Like, kid doesn't leave 6th grade and say like, oh, bye-bye district, right? It's like, I'm going to the next school, right? But I do think for families, there is a difference, and because so many of the initiatives at the elementary level are going to be not immediate. They take time, and the students who are most affected and families who are most affected are families of young children. I think there's actually a way to cut a distinction between something that might be starting for 5-year-olds in 2019 and what's happening with your 14-year-old now. There certainly are some families who live in both camps, but the thing that I think is, how do we cut that distinction really publicly so that people are clear which engagement's going to be more influential for them as a family and their child. So it's not to disagree with your point, it's just to make it more complex.
I think one of the challenges on this too is, I was just thinking about this, that when we get down to item number 3 on our agenda and sort of the follow-on series of SCTF goals that we've discussed talking about, a lot of those are specific to the secondary level. And so then the question ends up being, and I'm not actually disagreeing at all with Mr. Demling. I actually agree with him that there's a real challenge around sort of the bandwidth we have as a community to be able to engage around things and do things well. I think that's actually a real issue. And so sequencing and being thoughtful about that, I think, is a really good idea. But I think the challenge is, since we have a lot of priorities that we're engaging with at the elementary level, actually in all of our communities, I think we can say that generally, that doesn't mean we then set aside the secondary ones until we have time to get to them, right? So we're going to have to figure this out. I'm not saying you're suggesting this either, by the show. I'm just saying we're going to have to figure this out anyway. Let me ask for additional feedback now, And then is there another mechanism to get feedback on the timeline to you outside of this?
Absolutely. So I think individual conversation certainly, or by email, and I can filter it to Dr. Musad.
Okay, so you'd welcome individual feedback, so not group level, but individual comments on the timeline from members of the committee
Yeah.
afterwards that could be utilized.
And actually, just to share the feedback that we heard tonight around communication, about how to, that feedback is equally as helpful, if not more helpful. I don't want to compare it, it's a comparative tool, but it's very helpful as well. So I think I don't want the committee to feel like the timeline's the only thing to offer feedback on. I think the dialogue has been really helpful for myself, and I would guess Dr. Musad agrees with that as well.
Okay, is there anything further from any member of the committee then at this time, questions or comments?
I have one comment, if I
Sure.
may, when it's my turn. To the question about what is the compelling soundbite that will rally folks to this work? When I was involved in an early draft of the letter that went to the community, the phrase that was in an early draft was to achieve the strategic planning to achieve major priorities for improved programs and student outcomes. So that kind of came back to me as folks might be engaged by that.
Goes back to budget and stuff too, right? Ms. Marion?
Just kind of a thought as far as people having the space to engage with this process with all the other things. I think in some ways this is more approachable because aside from the teams, but just engaging the public, we're not asking for them to follow along with the kind of the minutia of the process necessarily. I think we want people to feel confident that their input is not just going to sit in a report and not get used, but basically we do just in some capacity want kind of the upper view, of the vision, right? So that can happen at, discrete points without having to necessarily engage long term, right? So I think that's a strength maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I want to move on, if that's okay. We don't allow this, but you know better than anyone that we don't normally do this.
No, it's literally.
No, you have to go to microphone now, you know.
It's literally up to you.
Dr. Baptiste, I know that.
After everybody's talked about it, if the chair wants somebody to say
I know
something.
that.
And I just
I'm well aware.
I wanted to say this is very nostalgic. I appreciate your metaphor, and so I'm going to connect your metaphor and add to the conversation by saying the reason that people go to the Grand Canyon is because they want to see a big sight, one of the wonders of the world. The reason you would want people to connect with this is something that we've talked about on this committee before, to be part of the brand of Amherst. So to develop a brand, this whole process is to develop the brand. You quickly, succinctly have that model, figure out what the brand of our public education is, and now everybody wants to engage to be part of distilling what the brand is. And that's the reason why people would come to this.
If there's anything else, we're actually going to move on, if that's okay. We have a vehicle now for people to get additional comments in.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you
We
very
still,
much.
by the way, have a lot of agenda left to cover. You know what I'd like to do? I'd like to take a 2-minute recess, a 3-minute recess. Is that all right? So we've moved all the way to item 2 on our agenda.
Pretty good.
Telling you, every time we meet, I always say try to move up things like accepting gifts. And people are like, why, do you want to leave? It's like, you want us to adjourn? It's like, no, it's because we can do it so fast and it feels so good to get something done fast. Item 2, marijuana it's called marijuana dispensaries, but obviously this is about retail activity around marijuana, so it's not necessarily about medical marijuana, it's more about the implementation of the recreational marijuana law in the town of Amherst. Because there are 3 resolutions that were shared with the committee, I would actually appreciate it if the superintendent could provide some introduction that frames those resolutions before we open it up to a more general conversation. I also think one thing I'd add is that, forgive me, I'm blanking on it, but if you look through the minutes, there was also a very robust conversation about this topic at our last meeting as well. And so, while obviously the debate is open for people to debate whatever they want, we had a long conversation previously about the general concern. Do you want to introduce?
Yeah, be happy to.
Including, by the way, if you want, if you want to walk even through the resolutions.
Yeah.
I think it'd be helpful to do that first, not later.
Yep, I'll plan to do that.
Thank
So just to connect last meeting to this meeting in the document, and I'm sorry, there's multiple copies, but the copy that I'm looking at was the one that I sent out today. And I'll get to that in a very brief narrative as to the trajectory of what's in front of you. So when I looked at the robust conversation we had last time, it seemed like from my vantage point, there were three particular areas of interest from the school committee and the superintendent, and talking to Mr. Jackson, who spoke last time, that we had three particular interests around this. One was around just the zoning, and by zoning, I'm not, to be explicit, I'm talking about zoning near schools, right? I'm not talking about zoning near libraries or higher educational institutions, right? I mean, there may be people who are interested in that, but for the purview that I feel, that seemed like something the school committee and myself would want to engage in. The second was really about how it's enforced, because we know that there are recreational shops. I think there's some disagreement even at the state level. There has been in the past, it's getting a little clearer whether they're going to be regulated like alcohol and alcohol stores, or like tobacco, which is sold in Massachusetts in more casual institutions in ways that minors can, there's no distinction necessarily. There's a distinction in buying tobacco, but not necessarily being in establishments that sell tobacco, and trying to understand that distinction. And the last was really about the educational aspect, and what onus do we face, what ethical obligation do we have to educate our students and shift how we're providing health education for our students. In this conversation, we'll say 7 through 12, but certainly as I look at it from my vantage point, pre-K through 12, given that there's a change in the law, how do we respond in giving students accurate, robust information so they can make the best decisions that they can make? So the first version, again, not to go too narrative, but the first version were draft motions. I shared with Mr. Nakajima. He offered feedback. In meeting with town staff, and particularly the town manager, I received feedback about some of those that led us to the adjusted motions. So I'll just briefly go through the adjusted one. So the first one's on the zoning. There's a warrant article at the Amherst town meeting. I want to do as a side note, I think it's relevant no matter if you're an Amherst rep or a non-Amherst rep, because all your students attend middle school and high school. They attend our schools in the town of Amherst, so I see no distinction, and that was really clear, and the town staff also saw no distinction between how an Amherst school committee member or a Leverett school committee member on the region would feel on this issue. But it's on the Amherst town meeting that mandates a 500-foot buffer. When we had the conversation with Mr. Kravitz last time, it was 300 feet that was discussed, and it was from the entrance to the school. This is 500-foot buffer, and it's from the entrance, from the property line. Worth noting, and Mr. Demling has a visual that I think he'll want to share later from the town. There's on the high school what layman's would think the town, like myself, would think is the high school property. Some of that is town-owned and some of that is school-owned. Mr. Sullivan certainly knows this from his work on the recreational working group. So that'll become a little more visible in a second, bless you. The second one cited that there are 2 state law requirements that prohibit minors from entering the premises of marijuana dispensaries, and it's really just the focus that gets enforced with fidelity. And the last one gets the resource piece. It's too early to say what revenue source will come in, how that's going to be played out. I know the town of Amherst has expressly mandated that the 3% revenue that goes to towns because of the increased cost of having the believed to be 3% cost in terms of having retailers comes to them, not to a non-for-profit. So there's some towns doing this a little differently because the town feels like it'll best distribute where the needs are, whether it's police, schools, fire, non-for-profits around addiction, right? So they're going to sort that out. So it's not specific intentionally because right now it's hard to have a specific ask because there's too many unknowns. So I think a legitimate critique of number 3 at the moment that I have, and I wrote it, is, well, is that all that helpful right now? My personal opinion is getting a statement out there from the school district that we see ourselves as part of the affected population before decisions are made is better than waiting till decisions are made and then saying, oh, what about us? So that's some of the thinking about the perhaps vague language in number 3.
So just to repeat again, item 1 would effectively be a resolution of the school committee supporting passage of a warrant article that we anticipate being before the town meeting in Amherst this spring. And the draft language presumably follows what's in the warrant itself. Number 2 and number 3 are further resolutions which are intended as guidance from the regional school committee to the town of Amherst more generally, that we want to encourage rigorous or strict enforcement of the prohibition on minors entering premises of marijuana sales or dispensary. It says dispensary. And then 3, that we think there's a compelling interest in the school district receiving funds when they are received for the purposes of health, well-being, other kinds of programming associated with the legalization of marijuana, right?
That's perfect. Well said.
Okay. So first, before we get to any debate, are there questions about what has been offered by Dr. Morris at this point?
A quick
Yes, sir.
question. With regards to number 3, I was just wondering if we're required to suggest that they're for health and well-being. Is that, or could we make it even vaguer and ask for the funds for any type of school-related programs?
Please.
So I think the committee would have discretion over that. I think the reason I added that language, which again, I'm not wed to, is because the 3% tax is specifically responding to the impact of the change in legislation. So I tried to make it vague enough where it's not like, oh, this is going to go to this curriculum at this grade level, because that felt, first of all, there's no process with staff to decide that. Health and well-being things are things that we do in general, so I do think it gives us flexibility, but I'm certainly open to feedback. I'm sure the committee will have lots of feedback on these, but it's a good point to raise.
Okay. Are there other questions? Seeing no questions, are there any comments? Mr. Menino.
I see no problem with supporting number 1, but number 2, it's an already existing law. I mean, what are we telling people to enforce the law in general? Why don't we tell them to enforce traffic laws and stuff like that? And at number 3, I'm not sure. We request a budget. We defend a budget. The town of Amherst reviews the budget. This seems artificial, sort of like a carve-out. I don't know. So I could support 1. 2, makes no sense to tell people to obey the law. And 3, it's sort of like it's a prescriptive budgetary item where we already have a budget process.
Right.
Yeah, just to respond, and again, this is yours to consider. I'm not wed to this, as I said. For number 2, I think, I'll speak for myself personally, not for the committee or any of the language. I would like to see a system where there's a number of ways to prohibit minors from entering premises, and my interest is that it's at the front door and not only when it's close to a purchase time. I think there's a number of ways and I have no information on how Amherst is going to interpret this, and I don't want that to be read into it, but my interest is being, in my role as supporting students, is that it's really clear to them that they don't gain access at the front door. I think yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Mr. Demling.
So I had a fairly productive discussion with the planning director in town, and she put a draft visual together. I don't know if this would be a good time to show
It's
that.
always a good time for a
Okay, describe
visual.
what it is. So basically,
But this is from Christine Brestrup?
Yeah, so
Okay.
let me just set it up. So she wanted to emphasize that this is a draft. It's actually 9 hours old. She put it together for me after we spoke on the phone. I basically wanted to get a visual of what downtown, the prohibited areas of downtown Amherst look like when you combine basically the two restrictions. One is the 300 feet from the Jones and pharmacy parking lots and residences. And so what defines a residence is they're still like getting all those T's crossed on that. And then the other rule is what's 500 feet from the high school property line. And so the red area is her current draft. Maybe we can kill the lights for the overhead.
Yeah, it'll warm up, it's warming.
But basically, going right, maybe this would be a little helpful. So this is gosh, where is it? Okay, so here's the edge of the high school field, right? And then here is the Kendrick Park Rotary, and then here's downtown. And so basically, as Pleasant Street comes up here, you have this one little section here and this one little section here that's currently not covered by those zones. So again, it's draft, right? So these circles might move a little bit, but the basic take-home I got from that is that with this proposal, most of downtown, and certainly the road from the high school that leads downtown, is covered. It's not all of the side streets in downtown. And just to interject my personal opinion, I would, given the number of unknowns, ideally I would love to know the lessons that we're going to learn in the coming year about what legal pot looks like in Massachusetts before we roll it out in downtown. But that being said, I think this is a notable improvement from what the current zoning law entails. And yeah, so that was from Planning Director Christine Brestrup, and she said that anyone on the school committee could reach out to her as well as economic developer Jeff Kravitz.
Okay, it's helpful. Draft map. Are there further questions or comments? They don't have to be completely fully formed.
Just,
they can be.
You've increased the property values for all those white zones.
Depending on what you're into, right?
Mr. Demlin?
One question I had, so this goes to Mr. Menino's question about number 2. To legislatively prohibit minors from entering the premises, so is it our current understanding, I don't know if you know this, Dr. Morris, does the proposed or current Massachusetts state law not prohibit minors from entering the premises? In other words, this would be more restrictive than the default state law?
So the way it's been described to me is that all these laws and regulations are coming together really quickly, and that the statewide Cannabis Commission is working incredibly hard, and I don't want to use a metaphor because I don't think that's fair, but that things are happening really fast. Even the difference of 300 and 500, that happened just last month, right after some dialogue, and some towns had already voted in the original recommendation of 300, and then they changed it to 500. So I think that's the sense I get is that's happening frequently with this, and so as it relates to number 2, these are the laws and the guidance that have come out recently around the minor piece. But I think, and I'm not wed to any of this. I think there's different interpretations of how that could be enforced.
So the specific point would be, though, that your understanding is that the resolution as presented to the school committee is the reinforcing the current state of law, and if there's a guidance to it, the guidance to the town is that if there are a variety of interpretations as to how you define admittance of a minor to an area, the guidance is essentially encouraging a stricter or the strictest, and I'm not parsing the difference between those two, but I'm just saying a stricter interpretation of access, and just to you could imagine, I don't know how long anyone's been here in Amherst, but I remember when I was a kid, there was a place called Faces that had a record store in the back and a bunch of clothing, and I think there was a head shop in there or something like that, all that kind of stuff. And so if you wanted to get records like I did, you had to walk through the back of the store, and it's right by where Ren's Mobile is, where there's this decrepit looking former bowling alley in the back that now looks like a danger zone for walking into. You remember that?
Yes.
You do remember, there you
Yeah.
go. Anyways,
Records.
you remember that. And so anyways, the point is, though, you could imagine, I'm serious about this. I mean, see, you could imagine, my stories are not just stories, they actually have a real purpose to them. Is that you could imagine a store like that, for example, and I'm quite confident 40 years ago or 30 years ago, Faces definitely would have sold pot if it could have. You could imagine having an interpretation in which there is a section of that store, X store, that would sell marijuana. So then the question is, under the interpretation of the law, would you need to have that section of the store walled off from the rest of the store so that in order to gain admittance to the section of the store, you have to pass through a secure area, not a rope, where you're like leaning over a rope or crawling under a rope, but actually real walls, or not? Or are you going to go sort of the other direction and say, well, there's like the dress section over here and the beads and macrame section over here. You remember how many decades ago this was? And then over here is like the pot section, and there's like nothing stopping anyone from wandering into it. But, but nominally, you're not supposed to go in there because it's illegal. And so I'm saying, my point of this is that the guidance under that circumstance is it's not really superfluous, right? Because it's trying to say, as the town's looking to review construction, when they're looking to review practices of stores and sort of educate the community around how they're implementing the law, it's giving guidance on it should be more. I mean, I'm not saying how people should vote. I'm saying this is the point of it, is to say we should be thinking about the more strict interpretation about whether minors get any access to that, right? So doing this.
So I find myself agreeing with Mr. Menino in terms of, number one, absolutely makes sense, and I think, if anything, it's our place as a school committee to help make a decision like that. And then I think also number three, I actually feel that that's another place where we definitely need to have a voice, and I've talked with Dr. Morris about this before. In terms of identifying as much as we possibly can the percentage of the revenue that we could potentially get from sales, and earmarking that in some way, or at least having the town, connecting with us to help us figure that out is incredibly important, because one reason that we have for passing this legislation in the first place is to ensure that the legitimate legal sales of marijuana products actually benefit local communities and benefit education to a certain degree, much the same way that other states have passed these laws previously. So I think that makes an incredible amount of sense. And I mean, in terms of health and well-being, or more general, I think we'll figure that out as we go along. I don't necessarily have a sense of that. I think with number two, I had a lot of questions when, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting his name right now.
Mr. Kravitz.
Mr. Kravitz came and presented on the, sort of what the planning process looks like here in town around the dispensaries, and had asked specifically about, whether there would be any kind of, how we could be sure that laws were being enforced to ensure that minors aren't walking through the front door or anything like that. And after conversations with him, and then I attended the planning board meeting, I feel pretty comfortable at this point that I think that the town is thinking about this in the right way, in the sense that the decision-making that goes into establishments like this, or liquor stores, or the other, sort of, metaphors that you drew earlier, people are already thinking about that and making sure that you're not going to have minors just walking in the door. I don't have any, and I said this also previously in another meeting, I don't have any interest in further criminalizing marijuana use and making sure that people somehow feel this, sense of this barrier, right? Or that parents now suddenly can't take their kids into a retail establishment that's already been legalized. I have that dilemma all the time. I go into a liquor store, do I bring my kids, do I not? There's always like this, you feel so guilty about all of those different decisions. I don't think it's our place to be making those kinds of decisions for families. I think that the town and the state have already made those kinds of decisions, or in the process of making those decisions. So I feel like I personally am very comfortable with 1 and 3, and think those are good resolutions for us to put forth. I'm not as convinced about number 2.
So by the way, just as a good opportunity, to mention that we're not voting on this tonight. We're actually voting on this on Friday, at the Friday noon meeting at the Professional Development Center at the middle school. Seriously, because I mean, otherwise, you know. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the table and let people talk who haven't already otherwise talked before I call upon anyone else who's already spoken. Ms. Kucinski.
One thing that we did talk about at our last meeting that I would like the board to consider is to express formally to the towns that we would like to be made aware and we'd like to be part of the process of when people are pulling permits so that we can evaluate and provide feedback on what the impact of a particular proposed location might mean to our students. And so to me, more important than number 2 is to ensure that we're part of the process. If we're part of the process, then we can be comfortable in knowing how they're excluding minors or how, you know, they're not marketing to minors or students or otherwise, you know, I just, it'd be more important for us to have a voice in the long term, whether it's through the superintendent or through the school committee, to make sure that we have long-term impact.
I'm going to move around the table and no one has to speak, but I'm just wanting to make sure people have a chance.
I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to point out that, you know, when the town sent their point person to the last meeting, that the buffer zone was right off the corner of the building, and I was out there before this meeting tonight with a wheel.
I saw
and
him.
I was, you know, to me it meant where students congregate. That meant the track and the soccer field, and I learned from Dr. Morris that was untrue. But now they have it's actually the perimeter of the fence, for the most part. So the buffer has actually gotten a little bit bigger.
Right, right.
I would be very comfortable supporting 1 and 3 and have similar reservations to Ms. Ordonez on number 2.
I don't have anything new to add, except that I also support 1 and 3 and have questions on 2.
Okay. Mr. Dinsmore?
Well, I can't vote, but I also support 1 and 3. For number 2, I understand objections that it's not really necessary to pass a bill to pass a motion that supports something that already exists. But also, I think Mr. Morris mentioned before that these laws are being developed very quickly and they might change. And also, even if we do pass a motion that doesn't effectively do anything, I'm not sure if there's a disadvantage to that. And also, about number 1, I think I'm reading this correctly, but does it only affect the bigger dots, not the smaller dots on that map? Which is interesting to me because the smaller dots seem to be the ones that really cover most of the shops.
Yes, I think that'd be true. Mr. Menino?
I'd just like to comment on my opposition to item 3. We already have one sin tax in Massachusetts. The percentage of the lottery goes to the town. A second sin tax, the lot percentage of the marijuana revenue goes to the town for symmetry. I believe in symmetry.
Okay, Mr. Dillon?
So just a quick point, the reason why the circles near the school got bigger is because it's the proposed change is 500 feet from the property line, which is like the edge of the field, right? So it's 300 feet from the building. You know, I guess I just want to make one last pitch for number 2. I totally hear what Ms. Ordonez is talking about with, you know, this is legal and you don't want to make people feel bad that they have someone who is underage and not creating that barrier. You know, I still worry about kids going downtown by themselves, middle school and high school kids, and what precedent we set. And so if this was a proposed zoning, I would say that it might be overreach, but because there's so much unknown and moving parts, you know, not having any direction makes me a little hesitant. You know, that being said, we can always see how things go, revisit things if But, you know, I guess that's my only, my only concern there.
So it's interesting. My view of it is, I guess, twofold. One, I actually agree with Ms. Kosensky's comment that having the schools engaged on an ongoing conversation, so actively participating in reviews of projects, but I think that sort of echoes something Mr. Demling said about being actively engaged in revisiting what the impact of this law is as it's implemented over time is probably more important than than, for example, number two. Like, is literally what you think the right interpretation of that is, apart from being profoundly subjective in terms, as I think Ms. Sardonia said, about different people's perspective on parenting, just for example, but also in terms of what the impact ends up being as a practical matter about the management and oversight of the stores. I think being engaged is probably more important than drawing a hard line right now. On item 3, I still would make a pitch for supporting it, simply because I think putting your oar in the water that the schools are, regardless of specific language on it, the idea that we should receive some level of revenue. I'll go, I didn't share this with the committee. I know I shared it with a couple, with Dr. Morris and maybe someone else. I was looking at a study from the state of Colorado on a survey, Healthy Kids survey, I think it was. And it was done in 2013 and 2015. And it was a scientifically valid, rigorous, confidential survey that was done, randomly sampling kids. And they legalized recreational marijuana back in 2012. And what they found was that the experimentation, as well as so one-time usage, as well as also the ongoing usage of marijuana by minors in Colorado, didn't actually change between before it was legal to when it was legal. There was around 38% of kids that apparently tried marijuana once. There was around 19 or 20%, depending on the year, that tried it on an ongoing basis. That, by the way, was well below the percentage that drank alcohol or binge drank, which sort of points to the point I was making at the previous meeting around wellness and wellness education. But the point is, there was sort of like nationally, as well as in Colorado, there was a durable, like 19 or 20% of kids nationally who, whether it's legal or not in their state, have access to marijuana, utilize marijuana regularly. And so to me, that goes back to something that I've heard Dr. Morris say more than once about how one of the number one indicators of childhood success is whether there's a caring adult in that child's life. My point being on this is that I would fairly well guarantee you that if you delve deeply into the 19% nationally or in Colorado that are using marijuana or other substances on a regular basis, you're going to find all sorts of other kinds of complicating risk factors in their lives that are affecting their ability to cope, to deal, to socialize well, to feel supported, and to succeed in their lives. And so while there are general education or supervision sort of interventions that we might think about as a society for in this case, the 62% of kids that hadn't even tried marijuana in Colorado in this case, or in roughly parallels the national number, apparently something's working already in a lot of those kids' lives where they're not doing so. It's interesting to me, though, how when you think about where there are people have complicated lives, they seem to have complicated lives everywhere. So part of me thinks, not to sound funny about this, but when I think about the diversion of resources, I think about how that overlaps with the kids and the families that we most want to otherwise reach in our community and find pathways to support them to help them make good decisions, but also feel supported to make those decisions. So my point on this is that I think there's a real pitch, regardless of what that money is used for, there's a real pitch for asking the town to in the same way they're going to spend money on police or other things they need to do with that 3%. Dr. Morris?
Yeah, just briefly to add to that, I know in Colorado there has been a direct increase from the marijuana tax to education spending as well. Both actually like their version of MSBA, which is not what we're talking about, like state building authority, as well as to local districts coming from that, because there's an understanding that the education piece is really important. It probably hasn't been funded at the level it should be historically, and that perhaps this is both an opportunity in terms of moment in time as well as a funding stream that's new to support that work, enhance that work.
And it's a question, but I mean, we don't have this, how is this phrased on? We don't have this thing on here as a vote. We don't have it here as not a vote. We just have it blankly. I'm trying to figure out, how, you know, what's our number for Friday, you know?
I believe.
I'm gonna ask the committee, how many people are gonna be at the Friday meeting?
I can call in.
So, no, keep your hands raised, I'm serious. Okay, so almost everyone, but not everyone.
I do have a relatively limited time frame,
Okay.
like my lunch break.
I was just trying to figure, Mr. Denver.
Sorry, this is a meeting during the school day?
It is. It's at 12 noon. It was otherwise called to have a vote on a series of contracts that we need to approve. But then the normal practice of the committee is to talk about an item one meeting and then vote another meeting. And I was just trying to get a sense of whether the committee felt it was going to benefit by waiting till Friday, or whether it felt it needed to move forward.
My suggestion would be to ask anyone at the table right now if they feel like they need more time to think. If nobody feels like they need more time to think, then it doesn't say not vote.
Dude, that actually was where I was heading.
I'm supporting what you're saying.
That's exactly where I was heading with this. Are people feel comfortable moving forward with the vote?
Yeah.
All right, then we should take this serially. Someone want to take the first one? Mr. Demling.
I move to request that the town of Amherst mandate a 500-foot buffer from 7 to 12 school property lines for the location.
Can you read the motion sheet?
The amended
The
one?
amended sheet?
Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
I withdraw my incomplete motion.
I did not recognize it.
Oh, thank you. I move to support the warrant article, Article 31, Section 3E1A, for this spring's Amherst Town meeting that mandates a 500-foot buffer from public school property lines for the location of marijuana dispensaries in the town of Amherst, consistent with the recommended buffer distances in Massachusetts Regulation 935, CMR 500.110, parentheses 3.
Is there a second for this motion?
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by raising your hand. The motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Anyone want to read number 2? Denise?
Move to request that the town of Amherst strictly enforce the requirements in MGL C 94G Section 4, A 1/2, XXI, and 935 CMR 500.140, parentheses 2, that prohibit minors from entering the premises of marijuana dispensaries located in the town.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. I'll make at least one comment. That seems like a gag motion, just to get you to say a lot of ridiculous letters in a row. But it wasn't. It's really serious. Is there any further debate on this motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion as read signify by raising your hand. Okay. There's 3 ayes. Nays, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's 3 to 6. So the motion fails. For number 3, anyone want to read this?
Move to request that the town of Amherst distribute to the Amherst Pelham Regional School District a portion of the tax revenue from the sale of marijuana to support educational programs about health and well-being, given the increase of products in town that are illegal for minors.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion on this item? All those in favor of the motion as read, please signify by raising your hand. Okay, that's 8 and against. 1 against. 8 to 1. Motion carries. Thank you very much. And our agenda on Friday has gotten just that much easier. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I don't want to delay Ms. Cunningham's presentation, but I just want to clarify in terms of the two motions that pass, where you'd like me and Ms. Westmoreland to share these. I mean, is there a request for us to share these past motions with any other body or people?
You should send them probably to the select board, to the planning board, to the town meeting coordinating committee. I don't think you need to, I guess finance committee, because there's a financial element too, right?
That's great, I just wanted to make sure we had a clear directive of where it
Sure,
goes.
and obviously, yeah, it would be kind of you to send it to Planning Director Brestrup and Economic Development Director Kravitz, as well as to the town manager. You can also get into the fun if you have an exhaustive list of people we want to send this to. I think
Post
that's
it on our
probably-
website.
Twitter. Exactly.
Thank you.
Is that good?
That's exactly what I was looking for.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Okay, item number 3, SETF goal presentation.
So I'll do a very, very brief introduction, which is that a couple months ago, the School Equity Task Force presented 5 goal areas that there were genuine endorsement from the school administration and I believe from the school committee as well. And there was a request for a report to be done to share our current progress and future work in each of those areas. As you'll see in the, I think, second or third slide, that there's a timeline for not just today's, the one that's being captured today, but also for the upcoming ones at regional school committee meetings this spring. And with that, I think I'll pass it to Ms. Cunningham, who's done the work of putting this together. So thank you, Doreen.
Okay. So as Dr. Morris mentioned, the SETF did ask for us to go over these goals and put together a timeline. And initially, when I met with the school committee, I did have a timeline that did not take into account all the snow days that we would have and the cancellations of the school committee meetings. So there's a new timeline set for some of the other goals. So goal 1 I'm presenting on today. Goal 2 and 3, because they talk more about the AP and honors data and the plan that we would have as a district to address the information that's found within the data, I've combined them together for the May 8th meeting. Goal 4, which talks about the discipline data and the plan, and that'll be the May 22nd, and then goal 5, which talks about hiring and retention of the diverse staff, that'll be the one that we'll have in June. So goal 1 talked about broadening and deepening the learning of faculty, staff, and administration about race and racism, with a special emphasis on systemic racism and unconscious bias. And what they asked us to do was to add $30,000 to our budget, also to submit recommendations about how these funds could be used most effectively. They wanted policy decisions made that ongoing learning about race and other equity issues would be provided for all staff throughout their tenure here in Amherst, and that this goal would be included in the school improvement plan or the district improvement plan and the superintendent's goals. And now that we've talked to Dr. Massad, I'm figuring we would also include it in the strategic plan. So since they were asking what were some of the things that we have done in the district, I put together just 2 slides with samples of some of the workshops that we have, many of our teachers and staff have participated in. So you have the District Equity Committee, which is comprised of teachers who participated in the UROC, the Undoing Racism program. They created this committee so that they can provide ongoing learning to the staffs in other schools regarding equity and all areas with discipline and curriculum and such. Then we have CLEAR, a CLEAR PD, which took place at Fort River, which the presenter talked about basically white privilege and the way the way white people relate to certain topics and how they perceive certain things in relations to how other people relate and perceive certain things. So this professional development has been taking place at Fort River and hopefully will be extended to other schools at varying points in time. Then the FSNE, which is called the Food Solutions New England. They have a racial equity challenge for 21 days. And in this challenge, they offer ways for you to look at whatever bias and prejudice or privilege and oppression that you may have in your life and to reflect on it. They offer articles and other development opportunities so that, people who are interested in accepting and joining this challenge are able to join and participate in. Then we've had the mass circles, which were for restorative justice practices, trained many of our teachers and our staff on restorative justice. Then the Cultivating Student Social Justice Thinking was a workshop provided through Mount Holyoke with Paul Gorski, and he taught how to lesson plan around the concept of social justice. Then, of course, the conversation with Dr. Beverly Tatum. And Embrace Race, that came about shortly after many of the tragic events that were taking place early in the school year. Parents were looking for an opportunity and a safe space to have conversations around race and just all the events that were taking place. So that's another thing that was offered to our parents and our staff to attend. UROC, which is the Undoing Racism, they focus on understanding what racism is, where it comes from, how it functions, why it persists, and how it can be undone. And so many of our administrators and our teachers have attended this workshop, and even our clerical staff have attended. The bias-free school training was a training for administrators, deans of students, and others, and we used that to teach them how to prevent bias-based instances and how to prevent bullying and harassment, some sexual harassment and just harassment in general too. Then we've had the restorative justice practices and alternatives to violence. That I believe was put on by Suffolk University in Boston, and that was another opportunity for restorative justice training. We've had the immersion best practices. That is an upcoming workshop that's taking place in the Boston schools. It's a 2-day workshop that many of our staff will be attending. And then the classroom strategies to support students with emotional and behavioral challenges. That's a course offered through our ARPS University, and I believe previously we talked about ARPS University is basically teacher-led and teacher-created workshops. So our teachers are getting professional development through ARPS U for this course. Then many of our teachers have also presented on topics such as diversifying text, diversifying reading, and one of these teachers just happened to be Jasmine Robinson at Crocker. She presented it through the Holyoke's The Village program, and the program explores issues in education. And then finally, we have our large March 9th district-wide professional development that took place. So now to talk about this professional development, I want to read first a comment that was made by our speaker who introduced the workshop or that professional development day. And so the person, and I'm just going to read what they said and then I'll tell you who said it. So the March 9th professional development topics were based on a survey that was sent to all of our faculty and staff, and just to ask them what they were interested in learning about and being able to offer. So the individual said, "It's a caution for all of us to avoid what activist and community organizer Elizabeth Martinez calls the oppression Olympics. which is a vicious cycle in which marginalized groups are pitted against each other. As she stated about the movement for equity, there are various forms of working together. A coalition is one, a network is another, an alliance is yet another. But the general idea is no competition of hierarchies should prevail, no oppression Olympics. Or as writer and civil rights activist Audre Lorde, when describing the intersectionality of how she identified in terms of race, gender, orientation, and economic status stated, there is no hierarchy of oppression. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Over time, we need to address a wide variety of concerns and issues related to equity if we are to successfully realize our vision of becoming a district that is fully equitable for students and staff members. And so that was a quote from Dr. Morris as he opened our session, our PD day. And so I brought that up just to say that as we look at the list here, we sent a survey out to all staff once again, just asking them questions as to what they thought would be topics that would be best for our district. And so one of the questions was, on which of the following areas do you think the Amherst Regional Public Schools should focus for diversity and equity and professional development? And so once again, these are not listed in order of the oppressed. It's basically in alphabetical order. So the percentages also shows we received 159 responses, and these were the percentage that shows each of those topics. We had also looked at information from documents such as the Becoming a Multicultural School District, or BAMS, and information from meetings with Robert Principe and Pat Romney, as they had initially, years ago, met with our faculty and staff just to talk to them about what they felt or what the staff felt the district needed. So all of this combined and the responses led us to creating this survey and the information that we provided for the March 9th. So another question that we asked said, please describe any recent examples of diversity and equity work that you have found useful and would like to pursue further. So if you look at the first one, it says those that are led by students. Then as you go further down, teachers teaching teachers is a great model. And then the other one right below that says working with professionals from other districts and learning about their approaches to challenging issues would be helpful and useful. And so taking all of that into consideration, we planned the March 9th day. Another question that was on the survey was, what other thoughts or suggestions do you think would you offer related to this work? And the first one says, diversity learning is not a one workshop deal. So keeping all of that in mind, the following 9 workshops were offered. So there were panel discussions with our COSBOX students, or led by our COSBOX students, and our group SAGA, which is a high school, I don't want to butcher the organization's name, but SAGA is at the high school, and it's also a student-led organization. So then we had difficult conversations about race. We had classroom management for diversity equity. We met the needs, or talked about meeting the needs of culturally and linguistically diverse students, the impact of poverty and class on learning, mental health issues in the classroom, identifying racial and challenging microaggressions, gender-inclusive classrooms, and restorative circles in the classroom. These workshops were led by our staff and students, and we had only 2 individuals from outside agencies or local, so community members and college professors. So before we get to the comments, I'll tell you more about the March 9th PD. Started at 8 and ended at 11:20. All staff, so that included our custodial staff, our maintenance staff, our clerical staff, and teachers, signed up for 2 workshops each. So because the topic of diversity and equity was so important, and that was also a day when principals already had other things scheduled and other, like the clerical staff also had things that they had scheduled. We tried to all basically do some workshops and make sure our staff were trained on the same day. So although the majority of the staff did sign up for 2, people such as the clerical staff signed up for one equity and diversity workshop, and then they had to sign up for something related to their position in clerical. The same was true of our food service staff. They also were able to sign up for an equity diversity workshop and then do some training regarding food services. So each workshop was approximately an hour and 15 minutes. Breakfast was served, and I know later on we'll look at some of the gifts and say thank yous. The opening remarks, once again, was by Dr. Morris. Our keynote speaker was Tashani Whitlow from Channel 22 News. She came in, and also Channel 22 News covered the event, and information about the event was sent to the Gazette. So after the keynote, all the staffs went to their workshops, and there was so much buzzing and hugs, and there was so much happening. It was a great opportunity. So at the end of our PD day, the staff were to return to their respective buildings where the principals continued with the theme of diversity and equity training. And as a follow-up, many PLCs or professional learning communities were created. So we have at Wildwood where there's a group that's reading books by Ta-Nehisi Coates and books like the Jim Crow, I forgot the
New Jim Crow.
The New Jim Crow.
Yeah.
So after the professional development, these were some of the comments that we received. First of all, the staff told me that they had never had an opportunity where the whole district were able to come together as one and learn together. So people at, let's say, Amherst Elementary was learning alongside people in Pelham who were also learning alongside people at the high school. And they were just so excited that they were able to all learn the same things and that they had a choice. So, bullet number 3 talked about they loved the teaching model of teachers leading workshops. They talked about it was good to have clerical and the diverse school staff invited to these workshops. They said, please keep offering this type of professional development. And that some of their comments that we're working on is that paraprofessionals needed to be included.
Can I clarify that? If
Sure.
you want to clarify what paraprofessionals?
You could, but.
Yeah, so just to clarify, this happened during a professional development day, and the paraeducators don't work on that day. I just want to clarify that they weren't in a different space doing something else. It's because contractually they don't work on the day that,
On curriculum days.
on curriculum days. Thank you for that language, but I just wanted to make sure that there was no ambiguity on that.
So what are our next steps? No problem. What are the next steps for what we've been doing? We put down, there were things about, if you go back to some of the other thoughts, it says, remember that this is not a one workshop deal, that doing diversity and equity work needs to be continuous. So we're looking for a fall workshop. We've identified November 6th as the potential date, and what our plan is to use technology, some way, shape, or form, maybe create a video to remind the staff in August when they come back about the work and the importance of the work and the importance of what they're doing and why we're doing it, and then have the large district-wide workshop in the fall, and then have something, maybe technology again, to continue in the spring. So we're looking to provide the trainings consistently, so throughout the year. We're looking for ways to include the paraprofessionals. We are looking to continue with the option of them having choice, continuing with the inside and outside presenters, include more students and student opportunity to lead workshops, continue with teachers leading teachers, and continuing to make it a district-wide practice. Then we're looking to also address some of the other topics that were listed in the survey. We are going to continue with surveying our staff to find out where they're at and what we continually need to improve on. And so after the workshops, we met with the presenters, and they gave us feedback as to things that went very well and things that, you know, can be done differently. So we're going to look to incorporate their feedback. And once again, we know and understand that this is just a first step. And through the collaboration with possibly the Alana Cabinet, the Professional Development or ARPS Committee, and many others who are continually committed to this work, we're looking to provide quite a bit more of these kind of workshops for the district. So with that being said, do you guys have any questions or suggestions?
Mr. Dunlap?
So very impressive alignment, and yeah, I really like how the survey was thoughtfully taken into constructing the day and then getting the feedback. It's I think the way that you organized it is a great example of that comment of this isn't just a one-shot deal. I was kind of wondering about what the maximum attendee capacity is for these things, because I'm thinking about maybe this is too much about like school committee possibly having the opportunity, if, you know, depending on availability to attendees, or other maybe community groups, you know, SETF, you know, other community members who've worked with the schools on these issues. That, you know, I mean, I wouldn't want to disrupt all the teachers working and the staff working together. It sounds like a pretty awesome community building thing, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
So I will say that that is one of the things that we're working on, is finding a venue that will fit everyone who would like to attend. I did have people at different colleges reach out and say, I'd like to be a part of this, especially since I'm part of the Para Change program, or, you know, Para Pathways. There were some things that we were doing as a district that would be great to include in that, and so people wanted to see. And so, yes, we're going to look for a larger venue to be able to invite more people, and the school committee and anyone else from the community who'd like to join.
Serious?
You could feel it coming, huh? Thank you so much, Doreen. I mean, this is fantastic, and I also have to commend both you and Dr. Morris and all the staff that worked on this. You know, this has been years in coming, and I think a lot of people have felt that there is a thirst for this, you know, to have this degree of attention and an effort placed on this kind of professional development. It's incredibly important, not just to educators and staff, but also to students, right, who end up benefiting directly from, you know, the more that we have things like this. And I just, you know, I actually am looking forward to future presentations on some of the other SETF goals that have been discussed. I think, you know, we have had, even within the APEA conversations, the union negotiations that were going on, there were a lot of questions around professional development. Right. And you've touched on a lot of these during your presentation tonight. And so, yeah, I think this is fantastic. I'm really happy to hear that you're going to be doing this again in the fall. So, you know, if there's any way that we can help, you know, with anything, I would love to hear that. So, thank you. Thank you.
So I deeply appreciate the presentation and thoughtfulness of the presentation itself. One of the things that we have talked a lot about as a committee is in trying to improve the level of dialogue on the committee itself, as well as also with the public. And one of the areas, I mean, you know this already, I'm sort of saying this as much for public benefit as to you, you know this very well, that a lot of the topics that are identified in the SETF goals are topics that have been specifically among the most bedeviling in terms of being able to find the appropriate time and venue to discuss in a very well-organized way and thoughtful way what the district's doing, what the progress is, and rather than looking at it as a point in time, but also what have we been doing, how do we understand what we're doing, and where are we going with this? And so, to me, you've set a good bar for yourself, I think, today in terms of our expectations for the other presentations. I'm not trying to be funny about it, but it's sort of like, just like, because I mean, the topics are unique in their own way, but they're also, as you well know, self-reinforcing in terms of a lot of them, both the objects of analysis as well as also the ultimate goods we're trying to obtain, self-reinforce in terms of these different elements. So I think that's wonderful. I also think that a lot of your emphasis on looking at this as really an ongoing program that's organically developed with the entire staff, but is well organized and thoughtful, and then also is disciplined in terms of sort of feedback loops to do continual learning and sort of understand what impact or change it's had over time. I think is really critically important. In other words, if in a different life, I remember once asking organizations what impact they were making in what are called gateway cities, which are some of the older mill cities in the Commonwealth that have high immigrant populations and high level of poverty. And one of the most irritating things that groups would do, and some of them were very august, large institutions, is they'd come in with a laundry list of, so like what your earlier thing around the different workshops, they'd come with a laundry list of activities, and then they would essentially look for a figurative pat on the head, like, aren't we a great organization? Look at all the things we're doing. And then, like, that would be it, right? Sort of the presentation would be done. Everyone would have checked the box of what they were supposed to do, and then we could all move on with our lives. And to me, the entire point is just that you're already in your job doing the exact opposite of that in terms of thinking very systematically and very organized way about how to approach this topic and do it in a way which is engaging the staff. So I applaud you for that, but also I'm putting a fine point just on things that I think in particular are it's good for the public to know. It's good for them to engage to the extent that people watch your presentation and it's made available. In other ones, I think they should. Partially because a lot of what you were saying, I think this is referenced earlier about Mr. Demling, isn't also just the exclusive province of the staff and of the district professionals. This is something that the community as a whole wants to know about. That was long, but you know why it was long? You've been to a bunch of these meetings now. I mean, no, I'm serious. I'm saying this. I'm not trying to belabor this. These are topics that kind of echoing the beginning of our meeting during announcements period. These are topics that have been extremely weighty and important in the community, and the building blocks of what I think needs to occur is what's occurring, and part of it is what we're doing here now. So, I'll leave it at that, on my part. Right.
I agree with all the other comments, and want to thank you again, Ms. Cunningham, because it's really great to see the detail of what went on that day. And I think what I especially appreciate is the ongoing nature of this work, and that you're taking that into account with building this professional development. And I think it's hard but important. When we think about what are we trying to accomplish, and then how do we know if we've accomplished it, right? And especially in a process that's recurring, and the surveying that you're doing post and pre and post is great. One kind of thought, which I think you guys are probably capturing this in some way, is to me it'd be interesting to hear what students would say as far as what the needs are that they see from staff in this area, just because they might have a different perspective than how the adults are viewing the situation. So it might be an interesting comparison, and might lead to maybe other topics.
So, Dr. Morris.
So two thoughts on that. I think three perhaps, but one would be in the sessions that Ms. Cunningham mentioned, where the students, the COSBAC students in particular, led. So both of us got to every session. I saw a lot of eyes open to hearing what students had to say and what their experience was. So I think just supporting your point about having the student voice in there as being really essential. I think the second is that, as we've talked about earlier in the year, I think one school's done, one school's about to be done with climate surveys that have went to all students, and that data, while not exactly focused on professional development, will be a really fantastic data source for us to use to say, how are different groups, how is the aggregate group of students experiencing, and how are different groups of students, because there is some self-identifying demographic questions, their experience at both the middle school and high school, and how can that lead us and drive some of the professional development, because that's a more formal context where all students are participating. And third, at the risk of overstepping, just I wonder, since we do have a student rep, and that's a question, not that to put Jack on the spot, but just to think through, and perhaps at the next meeting or something, just we have a student rep, so when it comes to student voice, just thinking through how we can access our student rep for that.
You mean right now?
No, I said perhaps at the next meeting. I did not want to put him on the spot.
No, that's good. No, I got
Some
it.
odd.
I was just drawing along. Ms. McDonald?
I had a question. I also thought that thank you for this great presentation. Being absolutely new on this committee, I had no idea that this was going on, that was the focus of that professional development. So I'm just very impressed with the work that you put in and what was accomplished. I did have a question, and it kind of builds on both of your comments earlier, is how are you, and I think you kind of answered it, is how are you measuring impact beyond sort of the pre and post survey from the people who participated? And it sounds like maybe connecting the dots between sort of a longitudinal analysis of student perception and experience is one way to do that. But I just would ask the question more deliberately, how are you anticipating you're going to measure the impact overall on the environment and the experience of both staff and students within the school over time?
So that's a great question. One way that we've started is through the professional learning communities that were established shortly after. So many of the teachers have joined those to discuss their practice, share their practices, and open their classrooms to others to come in and just see if there are changes. So that's one thing, and I've been invited in many of the classes to see what's going on. So that's something that, yes, more systemic and plans on how to look at that and address that will have to take place. But, that's just one way, is through the professional learning communities.
Mind if I add?
Sure.
So I think just something I didn't share earlier when I was talking about the climate surveys is the intention is that our plan is to do them annually. So to your point of longitudinal data, it's not just like plop, we're doing this in spring of 2018, it's actually to track changes over time. So this is going to be our baseline year, excuse me. And then the reason to do it every year is that we can then see impact of, and I think, if Rick Hood was here, just one of our former school committee members, he would say really what you want is multiple years, not just two, multiple years of data to see trend lines and then to make adjustments. It's not just for the sake of we've done it, and an accountability measure certainly can function as that as well, but it's actually another data source to say, wow, we're seeing a difference here, we're not seeing a difference here, we then need to adjust our planning for professional development. So it's a feedback mechanism. I think, frankly, most importantly, it's going to do more as a feedback mechanism than it will do for anything else, because if we don't, it's a sign of how we're doing, and if we get all students to respond, and we have good mechanisms, unfortunately for Mr. Dinsmore and others, they're a captive audience, but it's really helpful to get that on an annual basis. And the nice thing is the students change, right, gradually over time, but if the questions remain the same, we'll get a pretty good understanding of how our students are experiencing our district.
Thank you.
Great. So are there any last questions or comments on this item before we move forward in our agenda?
Can I just add
Of course.
that, in addition to what he said about students' experience in our district, we'll also know how staff and all our members are experiencing our
Great.
district.
Great. Thank you very much again. We look forward to the next ones. I should add, by the way, if there are, apart from, I know we're going to talk later about one way in which the school committee can engage with students, but if there are issues or there's something that you think that you as the representative would warrant bringing information to the committee, we have a set agenda. The set agenda always has given topics, and so you're sort of on the hook about whether you want to talk about that specific topic. If there is something you would like to, including responding to the question that was raised, it doesn't have to be that, it could be anything. If there's something you would like added to the agenda where you have an opportunity to discuss with the committee something you can also contact the superintendent and myself, and we can put something on the agenda. So I'm not putting you on the spot, I'm literally saying there is in fact a direct opportunity. The challenge with the set agenda is, the question before you is, do you feel like speaking about the specific thing that's on the agenda? I'm also saying you have an opportunity to bring voice to other things if you want to the committee. And if I hadn't said that before, I should say it now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Item 4, warrant review. It says budget warrant review, but I don't really believe that. I think you're talking about the warrants we sign, right?
I think so.
So we should relabel that, I don't know what it's called, financial warrants or something.
Everyone leaves for Sean.
It's more like they want to go home and watch us on television. This is a popcorn moment, right? You need to.
Wait, is this a fake one?
Yes, this is a fake one, don't sign.
Thank you.
I don't know, there wants to sign?
Huh? Oh, there are. There's a stack of them right here. A huge stack of them, in fact.
Well, where's the real one?
Those are real. Yeah, that's the real one.
Thank you very much, Sean.
So, forgive me, Sean, but just if there's any context without belaboring it, feel free to offer it.
Sure.
Meaning, in other words, don't assume prior knowledge, like people have been to the meetings before and know what you're talking about.
Right. So we started talking about the warrants several months ago, about how to make sure school committee members feel confident when signing the warrants, how to... Yep.
So warrants are something that we have to sign in order to be able to
Pay bills.
execute paying bills. It's required by state law that the school committee has to review. That's what I'm talking about, introduction.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
So-
what is this thing we're doing?
This will happen on Friday, more informally. So a warrant is just a listing of our bills that have been vetted, the service has been provided, and now we're ready to make payment. And so all payments before they go out have to be signed off on by the school committee. The one caveat is sometimes utility bills. If there's a timing issue, we get the utility bills out because we don't want power to be turned off or something like that. But that's what a warrant is. It's just a listing of our bills that have been vetted, gone through our process, and now are ready to be paid. So, at the last
Mr. Emmer?
meeting, we talked about...
Were you serious?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just a brief intro. So, but the reason why we're doing this whole thing is because we get these at the beginning of the meetings, and we just sign our name. And so the natural question is, well, what am I signing? You know, is this a state law? Should I be going through it? If I'm going through it, what am I looking for? And thus we lead to Mr. McGann.
So we have now a process by which we're trying to improve our group education process in signing warrants.
Right. So, at the last meeting, we talked about trying out 2 new approaches going forward. One is some sort of summary document, which upon further review, I think exists already in the warrant. I wanted to go through that, explain it to you. And the second is me highlighting unusual expenses in the warrant, which I've tried to start doing. Not every warrant has unusual expenses, so you may see it in some and not in others. But literally highlighting unusual expenses, calling them out, and then if there's a follow-up conversation, that can happen as well. So when I copied this, a page got missed, but it's not the important page. If you would go to page 8 in your warrant, this page will exist in every warrant that goes in front of you, and it's called the warrant summary. So I'm just going to do a quick orientation. So what this tells you, it groups all of the invoices that are being paid by fund and also by department. And it also has a available budget column, because one of the questions was, when we sign something, do we know if we're going over budget? How, sort of between quarterly budget reports, how are we doing? So farthest to the left is the fund. So just, you won't remember this, but Fund 1000 is the general fund. If we were paying something from a revolving fund, like our facility revolving fund or food services, it would be a separate fund number, and I can explain that as it comes up. There's some accounting, just our internal accounts next to that. If you go over to where the words are, that gives sort of the breakdown of what we're paying for. So at the top, where there's no available budget next to it, those are basically all the withholdings that we pay. monthly. So it's not actually coming out of the district budget. It's something we withhold from an employee's check and we send out. So you'll see retirement withholdings, insurances. There's some court legal stuff, life insurance. So again, those are things we withhold based on employee elections, and we send those out. And we still have to sign them even though it's not technically the district's money. Below that, where you do start seeing the available budget, those things are coming out of the school budget. And it's grouped by telephones, water, utilities, transportation. You'll see a few negatives. So sometimes negatives are okay, and sometimes they're not. So for example, the little negative for the superintendent group there, that's sort of a timing thing. We've been trying to do the transfers quarterly when we present you the quarterly report. So sometimes there's going to be a little timing thing. So if it's a small amount, I wouldn't stress about it. The bigger numbers there, the negative 222,000. So our transportation system for those are transportation accounts. Our transportation system is we pay for it out of the region, and we bill back the elementary schools 3 times a year. And that's Pelham Elementary, Amherst Elementary, but also Leverett and Shutesbury Elementary, because we provide their transportation as well. So those accounts are traditionally over budget throughout the year because we only bill back 3 times a year based on actual expenses. So those, again, I made a little note there, billbacks pending. Billbacks is a term we have when we use when we're billing internally, either our district or Leverett or Shutesbury Elementary. So again, this is the summary. I think this warrant is not a great example because there's so many like withholding payments in here, but you can use this to kind of gauge, are we overspending a certain department or category? And if you have any questions about it, we can follow up on it. And yeah, so that's that. And then there wasn't really anything unusual in this particular warrant to call out. It's mostly transportation, health insurance, and withholdings. So, but I just wanted to use this one as an example. And going forward, again, I'm going to highlight things that are unusual or that could be perceived as unusual. And I think that summary is probably the cleanest way. And I can make adjustments to some terminology. So if there's something in here that doesn't make sense in terms of like, what is that? It's unclear to me. If you let me know, I can try to make those changes in our accounting system to make it a more, something that you can comprehend better, because sometimes there's like, it's split into different pieces for simplicity's sake. At the bottom where it says RET teacher group in, I could change that to retired teacher group insurance so people could read that better. Questions? This is the start. Try it out and see how it goes, and then we can come back to it.
So as again, for educational purposes, there are warrants to be signed for the Amherst School Committee, meaning the elementary school committee, for the Amherst Pelham Regional School Committee, and also for the Pelham School Committee. Is that all? Those are the ones we have here, right? So the Pelham School Committee. So when you look at this beautiful folder, there are different color-coded folders in there, and there's usually, at our meetings here, there's more than one folder of interest, unless you're lucky enough or unfortunate enough to be from Leverett and Shutesbury, in which case you only have one folder to look at.
And there, in those warrants, there are accounts payable warrants, which is essentially what I just went through as an accounts payable warrant. There's also payroll warrants, which is just cutting the biweekly pay to staff.
There are additional questions or comments? It's not comments. We have to editorialize right now. Any questions, Ms. Ordonez?
So thank you, Sean. This is the ongoing saga with this issue. I appreciate seeing the summary. I think, while helpful to see that this exists, it still doesn't necessarily address the concerns that we had raised before, that I've raised previously, which is, the time to sit down and ask questions and go through this. And as we are going through the process, even at tonight's meeting of signing the warrants, we're still just circulating papers, not really, having an opportunity to talk with you about it. So, is there a chance for us to see this summary before the meeting, or is there some other way that we could, potentially address this?
Yeah, I would say in most cases we can send the warrants out ahead of time. I will say before a school committee meeting, there's usually a push to get a warrant done because school committee meetings only happen sometimes once a month. So there's some times where there's a warrant being done that day that you wouldn't have as much advance notice. But in many of the warrants, we could send out ahead of time as soon as they're done, scan them and email them to you all.
Mr. Dillon?
Is most of the warrant, like 80% plus of it, like all set, like a week before the school committee meeting?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, so what we do is we get batches of stuff together, and then that batch is entered into a warrant. Thought where you were going is 80% of the warrant sort of predictable, recurring stuff, which it is. Again, it's health insurance, instructional supplies. That's the majority of what's on every warrant. But I'd say it's not always, in every case, it's not always done that ahead of time like that.
Anything further? The good news about this topic is it actually never goes away.
Yes.
So if you don't have a question now, you can just come up with a question next time. I'm serious, actually. I mean, it's, in particular, one of the reasons why this has become a topic of interest is because it is a perennial role. It's a permanent role of school committee members. And so this has come up a lot because if you don't feel comfortable with what you're doing, or if you feel like you don't understand what you're doing, or if you have questions about it, this is one of those few things like setting the budget or hiring a superintendent, which are like absolute jobs. There's a lot of the rest of the stuff we do that is voluntary activities by the school committee in which we take on the task of discussing something. This is something like we have to do. So if you have questions, I'm not trying to be funny about this, I'm saying seriously. So if it comes up in the future, we'll talk about it in meetings, we'll refine it, we'll work on it, we'll improve it. Mr. Dillon?
So just a last sort of creative thought to try and address Mr. Ordonez's concern is, so if you maybe got on a cycle, I don't know if this is realistic or not, a self-imposed deadline of a week before, so you obviously wouldn't catch the expenses that are happening in the week coming up at the school committee, but if you just sort of gave yourself that deadline such that it was producible, you could then either email it out or invite interested school committee members who are concerned to say, you know what, I want to come in and meet with you and make yourself available, or someone in the office, so that there's some sort of a time lag between, 95 to 100% of the warrant is done, exception cases, and the time when we have to sign it.
Yeah, we can certainly try to do that. I'll talk with the accounts payable staff. One of the problems with at least the elementary school is we only have a half-time, so we have a 1.5 accounts payable person. So we have somebody who's always doing Region and Pelham, and the Amherst person flips back and forth between payroll and Amherst. So unless there's something super urgent in the week when that person's in payroll, there's not really much going on with the Amherst accounts payable. So it could create some weird timing issues. But I'll meet with them and see if there's a way to sort of, again, do it early and just put it out there so people can come in. Again, always welcome to come in anyway to review what warrants are there. If you come on the day before a school committee meeting, I'm sure there will always be warrants there to sit and review. So
I want to move forward just because it's after 10 o'clock. Unless you want to bring up.
I just want to make sure we sign every document in each folder if it's for.
Yeah, if it's for Region or for Amherst, you could do either one of those.
Yeah.
I mean, not could, should.
And you're welcome to sign any of the ones you want, but for requirements, we need 3 signatures for Amherst warrants and 5 for Region warrants. So if you see 5 signatures on a Region warrant, you're still welcome to sign it. But in terms of being approved, it's approved at that point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Close inactive accounts vote.
Oh, goody.
Yes. So a few meetings ago, we did this with revolving funds. We're now doing this with student activity funds.
Okay.
So student activity funds are kid money. We set up accounts and we manage those accounts for them, but it's all money that is raised by students in the high school or middle school in this particular case. I gave you the full list of our student activity accounts and their balances. I believe it was as of the end of March, just so you could see all the things our students do. There's quite a bit. But the ones that in particular I'm asking you to consider closing are the ones in red. There's a high school chart and a middle school chart. Because it's student money, it's not like revolving funds where it closes out to like the general fund and E&D. It stays student money. So what I'm asking you to do is to close this out to a student activity account that's used probably the most broadly by students, which is the field trip account. So each school has a general field trip account, and that's used to support field trips. In particular, if students have difficulty paying for a field trip, it helps subsidize the cost of the field trip. So for the high school, you'll see from pretty much all of them, I put closed to field trips account. There's a few that are class accounts that we're trying to get in touch with that class, because if we can disperse it to the class, the person who's in charge of that class, they can take that and use that to do reunions or whatever they would do for that class. But the rest of them would close to field trips, and even those ones, if we can't contact the class leadership, we would close to the field trips account. And so that's the same for the middle school and the high school.
And is there a motion someplace?
Yes, it's on its own page.
I thought so, right at the very back of that. So, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
A selfish question?
Yep.
Are you having trouble finding the leadership of the class of 1985?
We might be, you know.
I am not the leadership of the class of 1985, by the way. Not
That
now
one-
nor ever, probably. But the point is, I am a member of the class of 1985.
I'll have Liz
And I,
Haygood
in fact,
in contact with you.
I in fact happen to know who not only one of the most active alumni members is locally, as well as also the class president.
Okay. Yeah, so actually the Liz Haygood, the teacher.
Seriously,
who
I
did the
do. I'm
presentation
like,
about clubs
if you're
from-
having, I mean, if it's up to them to disperse it, I can connect you.
Yeah,
If you're
so
having trouble.
I'll connect
I'm a
you.
problem solver. That's what I do.
I like it.
All right.
Only if you know that they're still going to use that on like a student reunion or something like that. So, class reunion.
It's up to, I'm connecting you.
Okay.
It's their job to figure out whether the user, all I'm doing is connecting you.
Okay.
Mr. Dinsmore?
I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I just have a suggestion.
Sure.
Previous class president, we got a gift from the class that had just graduated, and I was wondering if you can't find the leaders of these classes, maybe you could consider, instead of giving the money to field trips, maybe to the current classes.
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly. So I spent a lot of thought, and it got so complicated that I said I think simplest is best. But if there's a simple way to distribute those funds to other accounts, I'm open to it. We could make the tweaks here. Originally I was like proportionally to all the other accounts, and then it ended up putting like 3 pennies into some accounts, and it was just good and overwhelming. But we could say, distribute it evenly to each class at the high school, for example. The only thing I did think about that a little bit. I thought it might be unfair because like the high schools had 4 years to raise funds, whereas the 9th grades only has had less years to raise funds. So I didn't know if like equally made sense. But if you guys want to consider a change, I'm open to it. It's not, as long as it stays student money and it'll get used, I'm on board with it.
So this is a change we need to make now, right? Okay.
So you could just modify it to disperse to class leadership, close to field trips, or disperse to the class of accounts, and then I can have one of those options, and I can explore doing that in a way that makes sense.
Can we make it even simpler?
Yes.
What's that?
Simpler is
Could
better.
we, for the class of 2011, 1985, and 1993, presuming you cannot contact anybody, that they get dispersed equally amongst the 4 high school classes currently in the building?
Okay. Yep. So first off, we actually probably need to make a motion, and then we need to make a move to amend. So if you have the back of your sheet, the motion says move to transfer residual funds as noted above to the field trips accounts at each school. Is that really the motion?
Yep.
Okay.
Doesn't have to be, but
Please.
it was.
I move to transfer residual funds as noted above to the field trips accounts at each school.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? For example, amendments being offered?
I would like to offer an amendment that the money from the class of 2011, class of 1985, and class of 1993 be distributed equally amongst the 4 current high school classes.
I second the amendment.
Okay. Say if you can't find the current
If you
class
can't
leadership?
find any class leadership.
Second the amendment as fully stated.
Okay. Could you read back the amendment?
I actually cannot. I was just about to try to, would you mind restating?
I could restate it. To move the money from the class of 2011, 1985, and 1993 equally amongst the 4 current high school classes, assuming Mr. Magano cannot contact any member of the student leadership of those classes.
That is seconded by Mr. Demley?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Is there further discussion on that motion? Does this satisfy Mr. Dinsmore's suggestion?
It does.
It does, okay, good. Anything further? Seeing none, we're going to vote on the amendment, by the way, first, not the main motion. The amendment as read. All those in favor, please signify raising your hand. Aye. Carries unanimously. We're back on the main motion. The main motion is to move to transfer residual funds as noted above to the field trip accounts at each school, except as noted. Is there any further discussion on this? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by raising your hand. Carries unanimously.
Thank you.
Number 6, policy first reads. So again, as we stated earlier, we typically have the practice of reading a policy and discussing it, suggesting and, giving feedback for changes as necessary, and then voting on a policy in a subsequent meeting. Yes, Marietta.
I think we usually have a second read, too.
Well,
before we
okay,
vote.
you're right, sorry, second read. And a third read if we need to, too. I'm sorry, it's late, I apologize. So who from the policy group is going to, Ms. Merritt?
So the first policy is JQA, food service collections. So we approved this, I believe, last year. And so before you are 2 amendments, or 2 kind of additions in red that were brought to us via the food services director. So kind of some needs that he saw that weren't addressed in the current policy. So the first one is that not allowing students to charge a la carte items. So if they don't have the balance to cover a la carte, then they wouldn't be allowed to charge it. So with the exception of milk and a la carte items, and Sean maybe can help too, but I think like this is like bags of chips, water, which I think they're working on a workaround for bottles of water so that there's glasses available. Or maybe someone else gives more more information about the a la carte items, but not the main meal, basically. And the second is that faculty and staff would not be allowed to charge more than 1 meal.
Is it current practice that they can charge more than 1 meal?
Change so that both
Microphone.
Both of these are reflective of current practice. Past practice is not always the case with that one in particular. We have some staff that have balances higher than 1 meal, but the current practice, since it wasn't in the policy, this is consistent with our current practice.
Okay. Are there anything else?
Not on this one.
Okay. Ms. Ordonis?
I just have a question about the a la carte items, and you guys might not have this information, I don't know, but I guess I'm thinking about students that don't necessarily eat the whole meal, like the entree, whatever it is that day, but their lunch consists of a bag of potato chips or something like that, but they don't have the money to buy it. Are we effectively shutting them out of lunch?
Only if they're only going to eat the bag of chips. I mean, again, we encourage kids to have a lunch every day, and the lunch is free. So it's not free, but we allow students to charge the lunches. There's no cutoff there. So I would say only in the instance if the lunch is actually the bag of chips. But I think in that case, we'd encourage the student to get a full lunch. If that,
I have reservations about this. Why are we doing this? If a kid doesn't have money, I thought we created a policy last year where we're not penalizing people for their choices.
Right. So our current policy allows students to have breakfast and lunch. The question is there sort of unlimited charging to, bottled water, juices, chips? I mean, it's up to you, but I could see a situation where if there is, I could just say if I could see an instance where if there is, and it's out there, then what is the sort of incentive? Or I guess that's the school lunch program again is built in some way, its main mission is to serve lunches and breakfasts. But the more money the program loses, the more money the operating budget also has to subsidize the lunch program, which takes money away from other areas of the budget. So.
I understand your position, but I think it's punitive. If somebody wants to eat a partial lunch, they should be able to eat a partial lunch.
Ms. McDonald?
So a question and for clarification, my understanding from my kids, and might be incorrect, but that they actually have many choices for what's considered the lunch, in addition to the a la carte choices, and that a la carte choices tend to be what I would classify junk food.
Yeah, it's Cheetos,
So they
Pop-Tarts.
do have multiple choices that would still be covered and not prohibited if they have an overdeveloped.
In particular at the high school, there's lots of choices. The middle school is sort of in the middle. At the elementary school, I think they have 2 or 3 choices for the lunch. But I think you're right that the a la carte items are typically, again, bags of chips, Pop-Tarts, things like that.
Ms. Kuzinski?
So I have 2 questions, which is my understanding also is that if you're on a free or reduced lunch, that a la carte items are not included in that anyway. That would be out-of-pocket expense.
So that would, I mean, that's sort of what this is getting at. Right now, the policy is silent on that. So, sorry, so I think maybe I misheard your question. The free and reduced lunch program doesn't cover a la carte items.
Right. So, okay. And then the second one is, are a la carte offered at both the middle school and the high school, or just the high school?
I mean,
Presumably not elementary
technically
level.
anything could be considered a la carte. I mean, you could go up and grab one fruit. If you're not getting it as a full lunch, that's considered a la carte. But the majority of the a la carte items are at the high school. That's where there's sort of, and the middle school. There's actually both have racks of chips, Pop-Tarts, things like that.
So, I guess to clarify the question about a la carte, it's not just the junk food. It would be also if somebody just wanted a sandwich and not
Right,
the
which I think
sandwich with
is-
the milk and the fruit and what constitutes.
Yeah, I mean, I think
a
that
federal lunch.
it gets into a tricky area because if somebody just gets a sandwich, it's not a reimbursable meal. So we do encourage students to get a full reimbursable lunch because it really would, it really makes a big impact on the financial aspect of the program if students just buy one piece of the lunch as opposed to taking the whole lunch. While it's still their choice, it would make a big impact on it.
So Mr. Demling and then Ms. Adonis.
So, given this is a first reading, this is appropriate level of discussion. I think what the information I would want in the following readings are getting clearer definitions. It sounds like, the general principle here is a good one, that if a kid wants a partial lunch that's appropriate for them and they're making some sort of decision about the categorization, then we should understand what that is. So we need better definitions of what are we talking here when we talk about lunch, partial lunch, and exactly what is are the a la carte availabilities. I guess I'd also like a little more just narrative description from food services about what the motivation for this was. I mean, I can imagine cases in my head of the thrust of this food policy, which this committee worked a long time on, and we're I think all very proud of, and has had some national recognition. Is the principle of that is not just to have kids come in and eat Pop-Tarts anytime they want when they don't need it. That's not the drive. But we wouldn't want to clean up and tidy the policy and have unintended consequences.
No, I can prepare a list of a la carte items.
Ms. Adonis?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I think that just having some clarity on the definition here would be incredibly important, because my initial reaction when I read this was that we were now sort of backpedaling on where we were before, right? And even that if that's not necessarily the intent, I could definitely see why even families might potentially see it or read it that way. And I also would want to get more information just about budget impact, because the concern. I hear what you're saying about that, money has to come from someplace, and if it's, money that's being spent here and not being recouped, that potentially could then impact our other budget areas. But at the same time, I remember us, when we were having this conversation, even just about collecting, unpaid, or collecting on unpaid balances, the money we were talking about was such a small amount. So, you know, if we could have a sense of what we are talking about here, like has the food services program been documenting the amount of money they've been losing on a regular basis because people are taking from a la carte, or is this just a concern that they have, but it's not really, you know,
Yeah.
just getting clarity on that would be really helpful before
Yeah.
we make a decision like this.
I think it's a couple things. I think some of the concerns I've actually heard are from parents. When we put in place this new policy, we get a lot more calls, which is good. That's what we were trying to do. Some of the concerns we hear are, if he owes money, why are you letting my kid accrue more debt to buy these things? Because it may be a case where the student has lunch, but they see a bag of chips or they want something. So there's been some input like that from telephone conversations. But I can give you more. It's hard because it's very student specific. I don't know if there's a report in our system that will sort of look at how many times these items are charged, but there might be. So I'll take a look.
Okay, great, thank you.
So are there further comments from people who haven't spoken yet? Have you spoken already?
I did.
Oh. Are there any, you don't have to, I'm just asking. Ms. Kaczynski?
I guess my input for the policy committee would be, I think I can understand the desire, you know, to limit extras. So if I've gone through the line and I've gotten my full lunch, I can understand not going back and getting a cookie. That's maybe not really necessary to have a healthy lunch. So I can kind of see that, but I also, I want to make it very clear that we're not penalizing somebody who maybe knows they don't have money to buy their lunch and they're buying the sandwich instead of the full lunch that they're not going to eat, and then penalizing them for that. Like, that to me feels very inappropriate. So somehow if we can separate the add-on junk food from I'm just buying a smaller lunch today, I think that's an important distinction, and not only in the policy but in how we communicate that.
Sure. No, I think it's a great idea. I think it'd be, instead of carving out milk as acceptable, I think it'd be easier to carve out the items that may not be acceptable, because I think they'll make sense when I bring the list back. So
I think that makes enormous sense, because I think that when I read this, it struck me the same way that was mentioned previously, that we did two things last year that I thought were very important. One was improve our communication and outreach directly to parents and guardians. It's basically saying if there's a bill that's owed, we want to make sure we're not focusing on the kid and saying we're going to, you know, make your life difficult, basically. We're going to try to communicate better. And also, I thought one of the things I really liked about it was we talked about, you know, interacting with parents and guardians on a regular basis, and not just when there's a big problem, but on a very regularized basis. And I thought that was also wise. So that was one half of it. And that's on the side of saying, you know, we need to balance our budgets, and if there's an inadvertent reason why bills aren't being paid, we want them to be paid. If there's in fact a problem that can be remediated, maybe with free and reduced lunch, we want to guide somebody so they can get support that they need in a non-stigmatized environment that's, you know, very private and everything like that for the parent or guardian. But we also, along with that, was the idea we weren't going to be penalizing and picking out students and sort of diverting them in ways that felt like some sort of food shaming around their circumstances. And so I just think that as it's written, I'm echoing really what's been said before, but I'm saying this more strongly now because I do feel very strongly about this. We made a really great advance last year, and so we need to refine this language in ways that can sharpen up what we're trying to do. And then I think we should before we vote on it, we should try to get broader feedback on it to make sure that the perception of what we're doing with the policy doesn't seem like we're basically reverting to status quo ante.
Sure.
And I'm not saying that's the intent. I'm saying I want to make sure that it's well understood in terms of what we're doing. The third thing, I apologize. So one third thing on it too is while we're reviewing the policy, I'd love to know whether collections are up and whether there's demonstrable evidence that communication with parents and guardians has worked. Because even though I said a moment ago, oh, isn't it wonderful we're doing it? You might tell me, yeah, that's great, Eric, but that was nice in theory, but it's not actually having any demonstrable effect on collections. So I'm all in favor of learning based on evidence. Sorry, Ms. McDonald, please.
It's a combination question and comment. Again, this is based on my anecdotal feedback
Yeah.
from my 7th grader. My understanding is that there is some food that is available for free. A lot of times fruit is available for free, and I'm not sure if that's sort of by policy or
There's a
like food exchange. Like I don't want this from the lunch, and so
Right.
I'm going to put it.
Yeah, there's a
So maybe that should be part of the make that.
there's a community table that
Yeah.
because again a full lunch that is reimbursable. But so when we sell lunches to students on free, actually all students, there's a federal reimbursement piece to that, but it has to have all the components. If not, then we can't claim it for reimbursement. So most schools have a table set up where if there's something in that full meal that they don't want, they can put it there and other kids can take it if they want. It's usually fruit. Not always.
Do you have something else?
No, I was just wondering if that was if that was already embedded in policy, that
That's sort of a
community table, but.
It's not. I would say it's actually been encouraged somewhat by DESE because they see a lot of schools are doing that anyway, but it's not sort of a formal thing that they say like do this.
Okay, so if there's anything else, otherwise we'll move on since we have more to do. Sarah?
Okay, the second policy we have for first read is a new policy called student activities. So this is brought to you kind of at the request of our new auditors who are wanting the school committee to vote a policy around student activity funds. So Mr. Mangano has a student activities handbook that he will share, and it's very thorough, and there's a lot of detail in there about how they manage the accounts. And so this policy was taken kind of from the introduction to that handbook for us to vote, because I think our auditors, maybe in an ideal world, would want us to vote the entire handbook. It kind of seemed not really appropriate for a policy to be voting something that specific. So they're also fine with us voting this. So this is why this is here, and then the handbook will be shared so you can take a look at what's in there.
Questions?
What does this do? Just codify a policy? What does this accomplish?
Does two things. So one thing is I could not find record of the school committee adopting the law that allows us to have student activity accounts, probably because it was done decades ago. So one of the things in that policy is that you formally adopt that law so that we can continue to operate. The other thing is student activity accounting around student activity accounts is very specific. It's one of those areas that there have been some well-publicized fraudulent embezzlement type activities in other areas of the state. And as such, DESE has really, in recent years, pushed the need to really have robust procedures around student activity accounts. There's very specific rules about you have to have every school has a savings account and a checking account. You can only spend from the checking account. All the money goes into the savings account. In order to transfer between the two, you have to have a series of approvals. So all that sort of stuff is outlined in this manual, which was actually pulled from a DESE sort of template and then modified for our school district. So again, I'll send you our existing manual that we've been using since 2015 with some updates to it. So you can go through it, but it's very specific to student activities, separate from our regular operations.
And this paragraph incorporates those rules.
Yeah, essentially, we talked about this at the policy subcommittee. Should you approve the whole manual or sort of approve the superintendent adopting a manual? And I think there's pros and cons of each, but one of them was if there are future changes, if we want to slightly tweak like the level that each school can have in their checking account, would that then have to go through the whole policy process again to make a sort of a small revision of that nature? So I think the way the policy subcommittee leaned was to make it more at the superintendent's approval level, but that's sort of why it's like that.
Any further questions or comments at this point? Seeing none, we'll move on. Regional Advocacy MASC Day on the Hill. Whose item is this?
I think it's shared.
Shared, yes.
Okay, then who am I recognizing?
Why don't you want to start and I'll.
Yeah, sure. So, regional advocacy covers a lot of things, but the two items that Mr. Ordonez and I have been working on a lot in the last few weeks are fully funding 100% of regional transportation, FY19 and beyond, and establishing a commission to evaluate how regional schools are funded and governed by regulations and such. Mr. Steinberg was here, he would give us a big cheer. So what does that mean? So we've sent some letters on this, and we've talked about this a little bit before, but there is quite a bit of advocacy from regional school districts across the state. I think probably in due part to the state auditor's report from last October that talked about a lot of these things specific to regional schools. Wachusett Regional has kind of been the initiator of a lot of the online presence, and so we've spoken with them. And so one thing that we did recently is we reached out to all regional school districts that shared representatives with us, particularly Representative Kulik. And we had a meeting with Representative Kulik last Friday with, I think we had 6 or 7 regional school districts represented?
A little more than that, I think it was almost 10.
Okay.
Yeah, counting ourselves.
Yeah, 15 plus people, a lot of superintendents, school committee members. It was actually really great to meet people from our area who are engaged on the same issues. And I thought it was a really productive meeting on several fronts. One, he was very receptive and very knowledgeable about the issue. He's the vice chair on the House Ways and Means Committee, so given where we are in the state budget cycle, which is the House Ways and Means Committee budget is being released tomorrow, it was very timely, and he gave us some really specific actionable information, which is the Ways and Means Committee budget gets released, and then there's this very short window, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday of this week, for amendments to be offered and co-sponsored. And then next week, during vacation week, all those, and I think he described over 1,000 potential amendments, so a massive number get sort of smushed down informally, and then there's crazy budget week the week after that. Anyway, so it's a good time for us to be advocating on that. And so we've been working with the organizers of the Wachusett group to get some materials together and basically get advocacy in terms of people calling their representatives, getting them to co-sponsor bills. We've also reached out to our representative, Goldstein Rose, who's on board with supporting these. And so, yeah, that's kind of like the snapshot overview, if you want to pick it up from there.
Yeah, so just to add to that a little bit is, so as Peter mentioned, that we have a very small window of advocacy and action that can take place. Our representatives, I think, don't really need to get moved at this point. They're on board. They've said they're, but I think if there are contacts with other regions, other districts, other legislators across the state that any of us have, get on Facebook, get out with your social networks, get out to all your other networks, and share the news of this advocacy that's taking place, because it's incredibly important. It ends up impacting school budgets in so many different ways. I'm also looking at our student representative over here. If there's spreading the word, I think, among students about the importance of regional transportation funding, having the state fully funded 100%, and just activating some of those networks across the state would be also incredibly important. Again, not with our legislators, they're on board, but it's other legislators across the state that need to be activated on this. There's a Facebook page, there's other ways for people to plug in. Should I go on to the Mass Day on the Hill? So as I mentioned at our last meeting, the Massachusetts Association of School Committees has an annual Day on the Hill, which is a sort of advocacy training for school committee members and for other folks sort of connected to school committees and education here in the state and the Commonwealth. And it's a great day for learning and educating, but also for meeting with legislators in Boston. We last year had taken advantage of the date and the opportunity to organize several students from Amherst Regional High School and take them to the Mass Day on the Hill. And then also I had helped set up, myself and Ms. Dwamini Cage had helped set up some meetings with some of our other legislators while we were there. And Also, well, the students actually had a great time. They were able to, sort of experience something they had never experienced before. They got to meet staff, and they got to meet legislators like Mr. Goldstein-Rose, and Mr. Kulik actually was in those budget meetings that week and wasn't able to actually meet with the students, but his staff was. So I think it's a very valuable experience, but again, I don't know that the mask down the hill in particular is a great experience for students. It's not geared towards students. It's not, it's made for school committee members, for other adults. But I think the event, or creating a similar type of event for ourselves in taking the students up to Boston and having them meet with legislators is incredibly powerful and useful. And so I think that the question that I want to pose to the committee is, A, are you guys on board? Does that make sense? Should we try this again? Should we do it again? I'm happy to volunteer again to do it. We had a great time last year. And then B, I think it's probably to Dr. Morris, about whether or not we can still go the same route that we did last year, with the Family Center, and maybe also enlisting the support of our student representative to reach out to the wider student community and helping select students and get folks on board. And then it's just a matter of selecting a date that would work for everyone. So.
I did have a thought, just in terms of capacity of people and trips to Boston and all that. So last year, I think you worked with the Family Center and the Kazbach group. So the Kazbach conference, which our students are going to again this year, fortunately it's in Boston, which is it makes lots of things easier. And so I just wonder, since there's going to be a group of students going to Boston anyway, could we link up some of their experience, because they'll already be there, just in terms of travel time and time away from school day, and it's a little later in May, so that's a little complicated perhaps for some of them if they're seniors, but it's before graduation. But it may be just, if the stars aligned, it's probably beyond we can't meet with you because we're in budget season from the legislator point of view, and our students will already be there, which I think eliminates one variable that was, as I recall, a little complicated last year. Like they're staying in this hotel, right, that's all planned. So perhaps I could share that information with you, and then we could take some next steps. If that's okay.
So you're looking for feedback, for sentiment to the committee, right?
Yeah, I think thumbs up, thumbs down. Does this sound like a good idea again? And then, if there's anyone else that wants to participate and, help organize. But I appreciate that, Dr. Morris. I think that's smart thinking. The logistics are already set up. Why not take advantage of that? And again, we're not, limited by this particular day, that NASC is setting up. So we can pretty much select any date that works for us.
Anything further? Great update, by the way. That was very interesting. Very, very helpful. Next, so we have a custom, which you may have seen in the past, that we have to vote to accept gifts to the school district. And in fact, they have to be enumerated specifically. Is there a member of the committee who's an alum, a veteran, who's interested in demonstrating good practice and form and making a motion to show our new members how it's done?
Depends how complicated the last names are.
I'm going to call him Ms. Cassandra.
I'll move to accept the gifts as follows. Florence Bank to support the HS Florence Bank 2018 scholarship in the amount of $500. Shirley, and I'm sorry for the last name, Muskamecki, to support the Leo P. Vinanalt scholarship in the amount of $500. The Pelham PTO to support the staff breakfast on 3/9 for $100. The Fort River Parent Council to support the staff breakfast on 3/9 for $65. The ARPS PGO doing business as Crocker Farm PGO to support the staff breakfast 3/9 for $65. The Amherst Regional High School PGO to support the staff breakfast on 3/9 in the amount of $130. The ARMS PGO to support the staff breakfast on 3/9 for the amount of $65. Leader Home Centers providing 1,671 various paint samples for the Summit Academy, estimated value of $3.99 a sample. The French Hysteric Comic Books to support the ARHS World Language Programs various 13 books estimated at $260 for a total of $1,425.
Is there a second? It's been seconded by Mr. Menino. Is there any further discussion? Mr. Demling?
So is that $3.99, 3.99 cents? Because
Three-
otherwise the math's off.
Yes, $3.99 per
Okay,
sample.
then that total's wrong.
It doesn't look like it's, yeah.
No.
1671 times $4.
That's not in the,
not included in the
the total is the dollar amount,
Deb?
correct?
I actually spoke to the treasurer about this because I had the same question, and because that's an in-kind donation, they don't, the company estimates what they believe it's worth. We don't recognize that value.
Okay, so we don't need to recognize that value. Asterix Comics, that's pretty cool. And it's, by the way, it's Leo Vigneault, who was
there
a
you
former
go.
French teacher at the high school, in honor of Leo Vigneault, who I studied French with for a year in high school. Anything further? Seeing nothing, all those in favor of accepting this as read, please signify by raising your hand. It is unanimous. Thank you very much. Let's do this quickly. For school committee planning, we have further regional advocacy. What's special education legal counsel discussion?
So I have an update to share. Our current special ed legal counsel is looking to perhaps have a different relationship with the district. I'm speaking in code intentionally because I don't know how to describe this well quickly. So
You don't have to.
Yeah.
Because this is for a future agenda.
Right. So it's trying to explain a model shift that, we'd like to share with the committee. And it doesn't have to be necessarily at the next meeting, but it's just we need to do it this spring.
Okay. Okay, great. Do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, there's a couple others. So SETF goals, so you saw Ms. Cunningham
Yep.
list that schedule. So looking at the two policies perhaps coming back, there's also two more policies that are ready for first reads. Something that I just want to mention, I know it's late, it's just that I do want to come back and offer an update around the middle school principal search. There's some things as it relates to employment and my role that I have constraints on what I can share, and then there's other things I can share. And I'd like to be able to do that next time in a little more detail than I was prepared to do tonight. I want to acknowledge the public comment that we heard and my interest and all of our interest in having licensed administrator at the middle school next year, which we will have when students return, and I can put a little more detail on that the next time we come back.
Great. Are there any, so this is also, by the way, this is not the only opportunity you have to influence the agenda. At any point, frankly, at any time you ever want to, meaning like 3 in the morning if you wake up and think about it, you can write an email to myself, as long as I'm chair and whoever's chair in the future, or to the superintendent, but typically go to the chair, or both, around an agenda item. But this is also a space on the agenda that's more public, where if somebody wants to bring up an item they want covered on the agenda, they can mention it. But since there's so many other opportunities to do so, no one feels the need to compel to keep us here any longer if they don't want to. Mr. Dunsmore.
I feel the need in one case.
Sure.
Because Ms. Haygood, who's the activity director at the high school, asked me to bring up to the school committee that there's usually, along with the student rep, there's a time about once a month when a member of the school committee comes to the high school and meets with some of the students there. So I would be one, and Abigail probably would be another, during the school day. And Ms. Haygood asked that could happen, I think at the last week of April and the first week of May is what she suggested. So she asked me to ask you guys to pick a time and a person to come to the high school at that.
Okay,
during the school
but the
week.
time is in the last week in April or the first week in May?
Yeah, one of those.
Okay, so that gives us a few days probably to work within that, right?
Mhm.
We could probably pick the time based on the person and the week, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I think the one thing we can do is we can commit that someone will come. I will happily do it if I have the time to do it. If there's any other volunteers who can join the happy pool of people who'd be willing to do it? Mr. Demling? All right, Mr. Demling and myself.
Not that happy of a poll. You know, bigger poll would be happy.
It's too late for me to come up with my usual ridiculous comment or retort to that. Okay, yes.
And I'm wondering if somebody could send out the graduation dates for the high school as well as Summit Academy, so we can put them on our calendars.
Oh, that sounds great. That's on the to-do list? Great.
Just as you know, but probably for the next 2 meetings at least, superintendent evaluation.
Absolutely. No, this is not an exhaustive agenda. Absolutely.
Just to clarify, since it has to be posted tomorrow morning, the agenda that the group would want posted for Friday at noon, excuse me.
Friday at noon is going to be on the unions, the agreements.
So we're not, right, because of the vote tonight, we're not
Yep.
talking
No,
marijuana.
that's it. Also,
And we're not talking, there was some discussion about superintendent
we
evaluations.
don't need to anymore,
Okay.
right? So,
Yes, I think that's true.
I think that's true.
Great. Thank you. I just want to make sure that we had it posted accurately.
I'm just trying to think, if you want to see the evaluation instrument and not vote at the same meeting, but be able to vote it before you use it, that might put us on Friday. If we want to vote it on the 8th, to use it on the 22nd, you might want to see it on Friday.
We don't have a meeting on the 8th?
If you want to, I'm just saying, if you want to, I guess we could send it out without discussion. If you want to look at it one meeting and then vote on it the next meeting,
Okay.
then I think we would need to look at it on Friday, vote it on the 8th, to be able to make it live on the 22nd. Is that right? I don't know.
I am happy to put it on the agenda. So let's put that on the agenda for Friday. Review, no, I'm not. Any expression on my face is just the time of the evening. It's not any comment or editorial on the quality of your comment. Really, it isn't. Great, let's put that on the agenda.
Will do.
Anyone else have any other motions they want to offer at this point?
I move to
Gentlemen?
adjourn.
Is there a second for the move to adjourn? Can't nod, Ms. Spitzer, you got to say something.
Ms. McDonald got it.
Oh, you did? Oh, I thought you were both nodding. Sorry, I saw a vigorous nod. I'm like, no, you speak up. All those in favor? We're adjourned. And thanks to Amherst Media. Thank you very much for sticking with us.